Welcome to Restwise. When you stop actively thinking, your brain doesn't stop working, it defaults. It fills in gaps, jumps to conclusions, replays memories, assumes intent, predicts outcomes, and quietly decides what's true, often without checking the facts. In this video, we explore 30 mental defaults, like assuming the worst, mistaking feelings for facts, turning one bad moment into an identity, confusing being busy with being effective, and letting anxiety disguise itself as intuition. If you enjoy long, slow, thoughtful videos like this, please consider liking and subscribing to our channel Restwise. These videos take a lot of time to make, and your support truly helps keep the channel going. And before we start, comment what time it is for you and where you're watching from. Let's begin. Assuming the worst-case scenario without checking facts. Picture this. Your phone buzzes. You glance at the screen. No reply. Minutes pass. Then hours. And without consciously deciding to do it, your brain fills in the silence with a full-blown disaster movie. They are mad. You said something wrong. Something bad happened. This is about to change everything. Nothing actually happened yet, but inside your body it already feels real. Your chest tightens. Your focus narrows. Your mood drops. All because your mind grabbed the worst possible explanation before you even checked the facts. That moment right there is not you being dramatic. It is your brain switching into a default mode that kicks in the second you stop actively questioning your own thoughts. Here is the unsettling part. This reaction does not come from careful thinking. It comes from an ancient survival shortcut. When your brain lacks information, it does not wait patiently. It predicts, and it does not predict neutral outcomes. It predicts danger. Your brain evolved in an environment where assuming the worst kept you alive. If you heard a rustle in the bushes, assuming it was a predator was safer than assuming it was nothing. The problem is that the same mechanism now reacts to emails, text messages, facial expressions, and silence. The amygdala, the part of the brain that scans for threat, activates faster than the rational cortex can verify reality. By the time logic shows up, your nervous system has already decided something is wrong. Your heart rate increases, stress hormones flood in, and your mind starts gathering evidence to support a story that may be completely false. This is not intuition. It is pattern completion under uncertainty. Your brain hates gaps in information more than it hates being wrong. If you have ever replayed a conversation and suddenly convinced yourself you sounded stupid, awkward, or offensive, this is the same process. You are not reviewing facts. You are filling in missing data with fear. Cognitive psychology calls this catastrophizing, but that word almost makes it sound exaggerated or rare. It is not. It is one of the most common mental defaults humans have. When attention drops or fatigue sets in, your brain saves energy by reaching for the fastest explanation. And the fastest explanation is usually the most emotionally charged one. That is why neutral silence becomes rejection. That is why a delayed response becomes abandonment. That is why a minor symptom becomes a serious illness in your mind. The brain prioritizes emotional certainty over factual accuracy when it is tired, stressed, or distracted. Here is what makes this even trickier. Once the worst-case story forms, your brain treats it like a memory instead of a guess. Predictive processing research shows that the brain does not wait for reality and then react. It constantly predicts what will happen next and adjusts only if the error is big enough. When you assume the worst, your brain begins filtering incoming information to support that prediction. You notice confirming details and ignore disconfirming ones. A neutral tone sounds cold. A brief message sounds dismissive. Your body reacts as if the threat is confirmed, even though nothing objective has changed. You end up feeling anxious or defensive without knowing exactly why. From the inside, it feels like intuition. From the outside, it looks like self-sabotage. And honestly, if you do this, there is nothing wrong with you. Your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is trying to protect you from surprise pain. Assuming the worst gives you a strange sense of control. If you expect disappointment, you feel prepared. If you anticipate rejection, it hurts less if it happens. The brain would rather be pessimistically right than optimistically blindsided. That is why this default is so seductive. It feels smart. It feels cautious. It feels realistic. But most of the time, it quietly drains your energy, damages relationships, and keeps you in a constant low-grade state of stress over things that never actually occur. The real cost is not just emotional. When you assume the worst without checking facts, you stop gathering information. You stop asking questions. You stop clarifying. You withdraw, over-explain, or self-censor. And then, ironically, your behavior can create the very outcome you feared. People sense the tension. Conversations become strained. Opportunities pass by because you already decided they would fail. The brain calls this efficiency. Your life experiences it as limitation. What makes this mental default so powerful is how invisible it is. You do not hear a voice saying this is a guess. You feel a conclusion. And feelings feel true. But the moment you slow down enough to ask one simple question, what evidence do I actually have? The spell weakens. That question re-engages the thinking brain. It forces a pause. And in that pause, you realize how often your mind leaps to the darkest explanation simply because it is available, not because it is accurate. Once you see this pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. And that awareness opens the door to understanding how believing your first emotional reaction is the truth. Your body reacts before your mind even knows what is happening. A comment lands wrong. A look feels off. A tone hits your chest like a punch, and instantly something inside you says, there it is. That feeling right there, that is the truth. You do not pause. You do not question it. You build the entire meaning of the moment around that first emotional spike. And just like that, your brain locks in a story that feels undeniable, even if it is completely wrong. What is wild is how fast this happens. Neuroscience shows that emotional signals travel through the brain faster than conscious thought. Your limbic system fires before your rational brain finishes warming up. That first reaction is not filtered. It is raw data mixed with memory, expectation, and past experience. But because it arrives first, it feels authoritative. It feels like insight. It feels like clarity. In reality, it is just the opening guess. A reflex, not a conclusion. But the brain loves shortcuts, and this one is especially convincing. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The first emotional reaction is usually the least accurate one. It is heavily biased toward threat, ego protection, and past wounds. If you have ever felt instantly offended, rejected, embarrassed, or angry, and only later realized you misunderstood the situation, you have seen this default in action. The brain treats emotional intensity as evidence. The stronger the feeling, the truer it seems. That is a massive flaw in how we interpret reality, because emotional intensity says nothing about accuracy. It only says something about activation. Psychologists call this affective realism. It is the tendency to believe that what you feel reflects what is actually happening. If you feel disrespected, then you were disrespected. If you feel unsafe, then something must be dangerous. The brain collapses the difference between internal state and external fact. This is efficient, but it is not precise. And when you are tired, stressed, or emotionally overloaded, this default gets even louder. Your brain stops checking itself and starts trusting the first signal as the final answer. Think about how this plays out in real life. Someone gives you feedback, and you feel a flash of shame. Instantly, your mind decides they think you are incompetent. Or someone cancels plans, and you feel a drop in your stomach, so you conclude you do not matter to them. Or you walk into a room and feel awkward, so you assume everyone is judging you. None of these conclusions required evidence. They were built entirely on a sensation. And because the sensation felt real, the meaning felt real too. What makes this default dangerous is how confidently it drives behavior. When you believe your first emotional reaction is the truth, you stop being curious. You stop asking what else could be going on. You react instead of respond. You defend yourself against threats that may not exist. You pull away, lash out, or shut down based on an interpretation your brain made in a fraction of a second. Later, when the emotion fades, you might see things more clearly. But by then, damage may already be done. And again, this is not because you are irrational or immature. This is because emotions evolved to guide quick decisions, not accurate narratives. They are signals, not explanations. Fear tells you to pay attention. Anger tells you a boundary feels crossed. Shame tells you something touched your identity. None of them tell you the full story. But the brain hates ambiguity, so it fills in meaning fast. That meaning feels personal and urgent, so it sticks. There is also a memory effect here. When you believe your first emotional reaction, you reinforce it neurologically. The brain learns that this shortcut works, even if it does not. Over time, this strengthens emotional reflexes and weakens reflective thinking. You start living from reaction instead of interpretation, from assumption instead of understanding, and the world begins to feel more hostile, more personal, more exhausting than it actually is. The shift happens when you stop asking, "What am I feeling?" and start asking, "What made me feel this way?" That small change creates space between emotion and meaning. It does not dismiss your feelings. It puts them in context. When you recognize that the first reaction is just a signal, not a verdict, you regain choice. You can let the feeling pass without turning it into a story. You can gather more information before deciding what something means. That is where clarity actually comes from. Once you realize how often your brain mistakes intensity for truth, you start noticing how many of your reactions are habits, not insights. And that awareness quietly changes how much control those first emotions really have over you. Letting past failures predict future outcomes. At some point, your mind quietly opens a file labeled "This is how this goes." You do not announce it. You do not even notice it happening. You just feel it. You try something new, and before anything actually unfolds, your body already reacts with hesitation, a tightness, a drop in energy, a sense of "why bother?" Nothing has failed yet, but your brain has already decided the ending because it recognizes the pattern. Or at least it thinks it does. What is unsettling is how convincing this feels. When something did not work before, your brain treats that memory like evidence about the future, not a data point. A verdict. It does not say this failed once. It says this is how this always ends. The emotional weight of past failure floods into the present moment, and suddenly the future feels pre-lived. Motivation disappears. Risk feels pointless. And the strangest part is that this reaction feels logical, responsible, mature, as if you are being realistic by protecting yourself from repeating pain. Under the hood, this is the brain doing what it does best: predicting. The brain is a prediction machine. It constantly uses past experiences to guess what will happen next, because guessing is cheaper than learning from scratch. But when it comes to failure, the brain makes a critical mistake. It confuses familiarity with accuracy. If a failure memory is emotionally charged, it gets prioritized. The hippocampus stores the event. The amygdala tags it with threat. And the next time you approach something similar, your nervous system reacts before you consciously remember why. You are not recalling the past. You are reliving it in advance. This is why a single rejection can make future opportunities feel doomed. Why a failed relationship can convince you that intimacy always ends badly. Why one business attempt that collapsed can quietly label you as someone who is not cut out for this. The brain collapses context. It ignores variables. It ignores growth. It ignores randomness. It just sees similarity and sounds the alarm. Same setup, same outcome, abort mission. Psychologically, this is called overgeneralization. But again, that word sounds abstract. In real life, it feels personal. It feels like self-knowledge. You tell yourself, I know how this goes. But what you really know is how it went once, or a few times, under specific conditions that no longer exist. The brain does not like updating models when emotions are involved. It would rather reuse an old prediction than risk another hit to your sense of competence or identity. Here is the part people rarely talk about. Letting past failures predict future outcomes gives you a sense of certainty. And certainty feels safe. Even if the certainty is negative, it is less painful to expect failure than to hope and be disappointed again. So the brain chooses emotional safety over possibility. It keeps you inside a familiar story where the ending is known, even if that ending is small, limiting, or quietly depressing. But the cost of this default is enormous. When you let past failure write the script, you stop collecting new data. You stop experimenting. You stop adjusting. You approach situations half present, already braced for impact. And that changes how you perform. Your energy drops. Your creativity narrows. Your behavior becomes cautious or withdrawn. Ironically, this increases the chances of another poor outcome, which then reinforces the original belief. The brain calls this confirmation. Your life experiences it as being stuck. There is also a time distortion happening here. Memory does not store events objectively. It reconstructs them. Each time you remember a failure, you slightly reshape it based on your current beliefs. Over time, the failure grows heavier, more global, more defining than it actually was. You forget the external factors. You forget what you learned. You forget how much you have changed. The memory becomes a symbol rather than a lesson. And symbols are hard to argue with. None of this means past experience is useless. The problem is not learning from failure. The problem is letting failure become identity. Experience should inform strategy, not dictate destiny. When the brain uses the past as a warning sign instead of a reference point, it stops being adaptive. It becomes protective to the point of paralysis. The shift begins when you notice the language in your own head. Words like always, never, every time That is the brain overreaching. That is prediction masquerading as truth. The moment you question whether the past actually guarantees the future, you create a crack in the loop. In that crack, new behavior becomes possible, and with new behavior comes new data. Once you see how often your brain recycles old failures to avoid uncertainty, you start realizing how many limits in your life are inherited from moments that no longer deserve that power. Filling in missing information with fear instead of logic. There is a moment that happens so fast you barely register it. A pause in a conversation. An unanswered message. A vague comment with no explanation. And before you consciously think anything through, your mind rushes in to finish the story. Not with neutral possibilities. Not with patience. But with fear. You do not decide to do this. It feels automatic. Like your brain cannot tolerate the empty space, so it fills it with the most threatening explanation it can imagine. What is disturbing is how real that imagined explanation feels. Your body reacts as if the threat already exists. Your stomach tightens. Your shoulders tense. Your thoughts narrow. And suddenly you are responding emotionally to information that does not actually exist. Nothing new has happened in the real world. The only thing that changed is what your brain decided to put in the gap. Yet the fear feels justified, urgent, and personal. This happens because the brain is not designed to sit with uncertainty. From a survival perspective, missing information was dangerous. Not knowing what something meant could get you hurt. So the brain evolved to guess quickly rather than wait accurately. When there is a gap, it assumes the worst because the worst-case scenario demanded immediate action in our evolutionary past. If something was unclear, it was safer to assume danger than safety. That ancient rule still runs in the background of modern life, even though most of our uncertainties are social, not physical. The mechanism behind this is predictive processing. Your brain is constantly predicting what is happening and what will happen next. When information is incomplete, it does not leave the prediction blank. It fills it using past experiences and emotional associations. Fear has priority because it signals potential threat. Logic is slower. Logic requires data. Fear only requires possibility. So fear wins the race every time, especially when you are tired, stressed, or emotionally invested in the outcome. Think about how often this plays out. Someone says we need to talk, and your mind immediately jumps to something is wrong. A manager asks to see you, and your thoughts spiral into I messed up. A friend is quieter than usual, and you assume you did something to upset them. None of these conclusions were based on facts. They were based on the discomfort of not knowing. The brain would rather believe a painful story than tolerate ambiguity. Once fear fills the gap, logic does not get a fair chance. Your attention becomes selective. You start scanning for confirmation. Neutral details suddenly look suspicious. Silence feels loud. Ordinary delays feel intentional. The brain builds a narrative and then defends it. From the inside, it feels like insight. From the outside, it is just anxiety dressed up as certainty. What makes this default especially powerful is that it often goes unnoticed. You do not say to yourself, I am afraid, so I will assume something bad. You say this feels wrong, therefore something is wrong. The emotion becomes evidence. And because emotions feel immediate and embodied, they override abstract reasoning. The brain mistakes emotional clarity for factual clarity. There is also a control element here. Filling in missing information with fear gives you the illusion of preparedness. If you expect the worst, you feel ready for it. Waiting for facts feels passive and vulnerable. Fear feels active. It gives you something to react to, even if that something is imaginary. So the brain chooses fear not because it is accurate, but because it reduces the discomfort of uncertainty. The cost of this habit is subtle but heavy. You live in constant anticipation of problems that may never occur. Your nervous system stays activated. Conversations become tense before they even happen. Relationships suffer because you respond to imagined meanings instead of actual ones. Over time, the world starts to feel more hostile, more judgmental, more unstable than it really is. Not because it is, but because your brain keeps filling the blanks with danger. This does not mean fear is useless. Fear is a signal. It tells you that something matters. It tells you to pay attention. But it does not tell you what the truth is. When fear becomes the default filler for missing information, it stops being protective and starts being distortive. It narrows your perception and limits your options. The moment this pattern loosens its grip is when you notice the gap itself, when you catch yourself reacting strongly and ask, what information am I actually missing right now? That question shifts the brain out of prediction mode and back into observation. It slows the process. It creates space for logic to enter. Often, you realize there are multiple possible explanations, most of them neutral. And even if the worst case is possible, it is rarely the only option. Once you see how often your brain fills silence and ambiguity with fear, you start noticing how many of your emotional reactions are responses to stories, not events, and that realization changes how much power uncertainty has over you. Confusing familiarity with correctness. There is a strange comfort in thoughts you have had 1,000 times before. They show up quietly, already shaped, already familiar. You do not argue with them. You do not inspect them. You just nod internally and move on, because they feel known. They feel safe. And without realizing it, your brain treats that familiarity as proof that the thought must be correct, not because it has been tested, but because it has been repeated. This is one of the most subtle mental defaults the brain uses. When something feels familiar, the brain lowers its guard. It stops analyzing. It stops questioning. Familiarity creates a sense of ease, and the brain mistakes ease for accuracy. The thought does not trigger resistance, so it slides right through. And once it is inside, it shapes your perception, your decisions, and your behavior without ever announcing itself as an assumption. What is unsettling is how early this process starts. The brain is constantly trying to conserve energy. Deep analysis is expensive. Familiar patterns are cheap. When a thought has been activated many times before, the neural pathway becomes efficient. It fires smoothly. That smoothness feels like truth. Psychologists call this processing fluency. The easier something is to process, the more true it feels. Not because it is more accurate, but because it requires less effort. This is why old beliefs stick even when evidence changes. If you have always believed you are bad at speaking up, that belief feels correct every time it appears. Not because you have verified it recently, but because it has been rehearsed. If you have always believed certain people cannot be trusted, that idea feels solid even in moments when nothing bad is happening. The brain says, I know this thought, therefore it must be right. Familiarity becomes a shortcut for judgment. Think about how this shows up emotionally. You walk into a situation and instantly feel a certain way, not because something new occurred, but because it reminds you of something old. A tone of voice feels wrong because it resembles a past conflict. A challenge feels impossible because it resembles a past failure. The brain does not pause to ask whether the situation is actually the same. Similarity is enough. Familiar emotional responses kick in, and the conclusions feel obvious. This is especially powerful with self-beliefs. The thoughts you have repeated about who you are start to feel like facts. I always mess this up. I am not the kind of person who succeeds at this. This never works out for me. These thoughts feel correct not because they are true, but because they are well-worn. The brain prefers known pain over unknown possibility. Familiar disappointment feels safer than unfamiliar hope. There is also a memory illusion at play. The brain is more likely to recall information that fits familiar beliefs. This creates a feedback loop. You remember examples that confirm the belief and forget the ones that challenge it. Over time, familiarity grows stronger, and the belief feels increasingly justified. From the inside, it feels like experience. From the outside, it is selective recall. What makes this default so dangerous is that it does not feel emotional or dramatic. It feels calm, reasonable, grounded. That is why it rarely gets questioned. You do not feel anxious or alarmed. You feel settled. And that sense of settling tricks the brain into thinking no further thought is needed. But correctness does not announce itself with comfort. Many false ideas feel incredibly familiar simply because they have been rehearsed. This also explains why change feels so uncomfortable even when it is positive. New ideas require new pathways. New interpretations feel awkward and effortful. The brain resists them not because they are wrong, but because they are unfamiliar. Discomfort gets interpreted as danger. So the brain retreats back to old explanations that feel smooth and known, even if they no longer serve you. Again, this is not a personal flaw. This is how human cognition works. Familiarity was a reliable signal in stable environments. If something kept happening the same way, it probably would continue. But modern life is complex and dynamic. Familiarity is no longer a guarantee of accuracy. It is just a record of repetition. The shift begins when you notice how often your certainty comes from repetition rather than evidence. When you ask yourself, is this true, or is this just well practiced? That question alone creates friction. It interrupts the automatic trust you place in familiar thoughts. It does not mean every familiar idea is wrong. It means familiarity alone is no longer enough to decide. When you slow down and examine a belief that feels obvious, you often discover it has not been updated in years. It is running on outdated data. And the moment you see that, the grip loosens. The thought loses its authority. It becomes one possibility instead of a fact. Once you recognize how often familiarity masquerades as correctness, you start realizing how many of your mental habits are inherited, not chosen. And that awareness quietly gives you the power to think again, instead of just remembering. Defaulting to self-blame when something goes wrong Something goes wrong, and before anyone says a word, your mind turns inward. Your stomach drops. Your shoulders tense, and a quiet conclusion forms almost instantly. This is on me. Even if the situation is messy, unclear, or involves a dozen moving parts, your brain zooms straight to self-blame like it was waiting there all along. You do not analyze the full picture. You do not pause to gather facts. You just feel the weight settle on your chest as if guilt arrived before evidence. What makes this default so powerful is how fast and personal it feels. There is no debate, no internal discussion. The emotion hits first, and the explanation follows. I should have known better. I messed this up. I am the problem. And because the explanation points at you, it feels honest, responsible, even moral. Taking blame feels like maturity, but in many cases it is just your brain choosing the simplest story it can tell. From a psychological standpoint, this is not humility. It is control. When something goes wrong, uncertainty spikes. The brain hates uncertainty. Blaming yourself collapses complexity into a single cause. You. That hurts, but it feels clear. Clear feels safer than ambiguous. If it is your fault, at least the world still makes sense. At least there is a reason. The brain would rather feel bad than feel confused. There is also a learning mechanism involved. As children, many people learn that taking responsibility reduces conflict. Owning blame can calm others. It can end tension faster. Over time, the brain learns that self-blame is a way to regain emotional stability. So when things go wrong later in life, that old strategy activates automatically. You take the hit internally to restore order externally. The problem is that this habit does not scale well into adulthood, where outcomes are rarely caused by one person alone. Neuroscience adds another layer. The brain has a negativity bias. Negative interpretations are processed more deeply than neutral ones. When something fails, the brain scans for error, and it often starts with the self, because you are the most available variable. You know your intentions. You remember your doubts. You replay your decisions. Other factors feel distant or abstract. So the brain fills the gap by turning the spotlight inward and assuming causation. Think about how often this happens in everyday life. A project misses the mark, and you immediately focus on what you did wrong, even if others contributed equally. A relationship feels tense, and you assume you are too much or not enough. Someone reacts poorly, and you instinctively search your own behavior for the flaw that must have caused it. You do not do this because it is accurate. You do it because your brain equates self-blame with insight. The emotional logic goes like this. If it is my fault, then I can fix it. That sounds empowering, but it is only partially true. When blame replaces analysis, learning actually shuts down. You skip over understanding what really happened and jump straight to self-judgment. Judgment feels productive, but it rarely is. It drains energy, lowers confidence, and narrows perspective. You feel responsible, but not capable. What makes this default especially sneaky is how it disguises itself as accountability. True accountability involves clarity. It separates what you could control from what you could not. Self-blame does the opposite. It blurs everything together. It turns complex outcomes into personal defects. Instead of saying this part was mine and this part was not, the brain says all of this reflects who I am. That is not responsibility. That is identity distortion. Over time, this pattern shapes how you see yourself. If every mistake becomes evidence of a flawed self, your self-image slowly erodes. You become hypervigilant. You overthink. You second-guess. You try to preempt failure by being harder on yourself than anyone else could be. The brain believes this will prevent future mistakes, but research shows the opposite. Excessive self-blame increases anxiety and decreases performance. When you are busy punishing yourself, you are not fully present to improve. And again, this does not mean you should never take responsibility. It means responsibility without proportion becomes self-harm. The brain defaults to self-blame because it feels like action. But action without accuracy leads nowhere. The shift starts when you notice how quickly blame appears, not after reflection, immediately. That speed is the clue. When you catch yourself asking, "What did I do wrong?" before you even know what went wrong, you are watching the default in real time. That moment is an opening. Instead of asking, "How is this my fault?" you can ask what factors were actually involved. That question widens the frame. It invites logic back in. When you slow the process down, you often discover that your role was smaller than your emotions suggested, or different, or not central at all. And even when you did make a mistake, seeing it clearly instead of globally allows learning instead of shame. Once you realize how often your brain uses self-blame to escape uncertainty, you start treating that instinct with more caution. You stop assuming guilt equals truth. And in that space, you begin responding to problems instead of absorbing them as proof that something is wrong with you. Interpreting silence as rejection or disapproval. A silence hits harder than words ever could. A message left on read. A pause after you share something personal. Someone who usually responds quickly suddenly goes quiet. And before anything concrete happens, your chest sinks. Your mind does not wait. It decides. They are pulling away. You said something wrong. You are not important to them. The silence itself becomes the message, even though no message was actually sent. What makes this so powerful is that silence gives your brain total creative freedom. There are no facts to push back against the story it wants to tell. So it reaches for the explanation that hurts the most, because that explanation feels familiar and emotionally charged. Rejection, disapproval, disinterest. These interpretations light up old emotional circuits, and once those circuits fire, your body reacts as if the conclusion is already confirmed. Your mood shifts, your confidence dips, your behavior changes, all in response to an absence. From a neurological standpoint, this makes sense. The human brain is wired for social survival. For most of human history, being excluded from the group was dangerous. Silence from others could signal loss of safety, loss of resources, or loss of belonging. So the brain evolved to treat social ambiguity as a potential threat. When there is no feedback, the brain assumes negative intent, because missing a social warning sign was riskier than misreading one. The problem is that modern silence usually has nothing to do with rejection. People are busy, distracted or stimulated, emotionally overwhelmed. They forget, they delay, they need time. But the brain does not default to those explanations. It defaults to the one that demands the most vigilance. The amygdala activates, stress hormones rise, and suddenly you are emotionally bracing for a rejection that exists only in your interpretation. Psychology refers to this as mind reading, but that label does not capture how visceral it feels. You are not calmly guessing what someone thinks. You are feeling it. The absence of response triggers the same neural pain pathways as physical pain. Studies on social exclusion show that silence activates the anterior cingulate cortex, the same region involved when you experience bodily harm. That is why it hurts. Not metaphorically, literally. Once the brain interprets silence as disapproval, it starts rewriting the past. You replay what you said. You scrutinize your tone. You search for mistakes that could explain the imagined rejection. The brain is trying to regain control by finding a cause. And because you are the most accessible variable, the cause often becomes you. Maybe I was too much. Maybe I overshared. Maybe I annoyed them. The silence becomes proof that something is wrong with you. What makes this default especially damaging is how it changes your behavior going forward. You might pull back to protect yourself. You might over-explain to fix a problem that does not exist. You might become guarded, colder, or less expressive. Ironically, those changes can create real distance, which then seems to confirm your original fear. The brain calls this pattern recognition. Your life experiences it as disconnection. And again, this is not because you are insecure or needy. It is because your brain is trying to protect your sense of belonging. Belonging is not a luxury to the nervous system. It is a survival need. So when feedback disappears, the brain fills in the gap with the explanation that keeps you alert to potential loss. There is also a control illusion here. Interpreting silence as rejection gives you something solid to react to. Uncertainty feels helpless. Rejection feels painful, but at least it is defined. The brain prefers a bad answer over no answer at all. Silence leaves too many possibilities open, and the brain is uncomfortable with open loops. The cost of this habit is that you start responding to people based on imagined meanings instead of real interactions. You treat silence as communication when it is often just absence. Over time, this trains your nervous system to associate quiet with danger. You become hypersensitive to response times, tone gaps, and pauses. Relationships start to feel fragile, not because they are, but because your brain keeps sounding false alarms. The shift begins when you separate silence from meaning. Silence is data, but it is incomplete data. It does not come preloaded with intent. When you notice the emotional spike and ask what else could explain this silence, you slow the process down. You re-engage the thinking brain. You remind yourself that lack of response is not the same as negative response. This does not mean ignoring your feelings. It means contextualizing them. The feeling is real. The conclusion is optional. When you let silence stay neutral until proven otherwise, you stop punishing yourself for information you do not have. Once you see how often your brain equates quiet with rejection, you realize how many emotional wounds come not from what people do, but from what your mind assumes in the empty space they leave behind. Trusting gut feelings even when they're based on anxiety. Sometimes it hits you out of nowhere. A tight feeling in your chest, a sudden sense of dread, an urge to pull away, cancel, avoid, or say no, and almost immediately a reassuring thought follows. Trust your gut. You do not analyze it. You do not slow down. You assume that feeling is wisdom speaking, that it knows something you do not, so you obey it, even though you cannot explain why. The shock comes when you realize how often that gut feeling is not intuition at all. It is anxiety wearing a convincing disguise. Anxiety does not announce itself as fear. It presents itself as urgency, as insight, as a warning you would be foolish to ignore. And because it feels physical and immediate, it carries authority. The body reacts, so the mind concludes there must be a reason. But that conclusion skips a critical step, asking where the feeling actually came from. Neurologically, anxiety is not a prediction system. It is a sensitivity system. An anxious brain is tuned to detect potential threat, not actual danger. The amygdala becomes hyper-responsive. It flags uncertainty as risk, novelty as danger, ambiguity as something that must be avoided. When that alarm goes off, your body responds instantly. Heart rate shifts, muscles tense, thoughts narrow. And because these sensations arrive before conscious thought, they feel like intuition. But intuition integrates information calmly. Anxiety demands action immediately. This is where the confusion happens. True gut instinct tends to be quiet. It does not panic. It does not rush. It does not come with a spiral of catastrophic thoughts. Anxiety does. But when you are used to anxiety, that intensity feels normal. So you label it insight. You say, I just have a bad feeling about this person, this opportunity, this conversation. And maybe sometimes you are right. But often, the feeling is not about the situation at all. It is about your nervous system being overloaded. Think about how this plays out. You feel anxious before a meeting, so you decide something bad will happen. You feel uneasy starting something new, so you conclude it is not meant for you. You feel tension around someone, so you assume they cannot be trusted. In each case, the feeling came first. The explanation followed, and because the explanation matched the emotion, it felt true. But feelings are not evidence. They are signals, and anxious signals are notoriously unreliable narrators. Psychology research shows that anxious individuals are more likely to overestimate threat and underestimate their ability to cope. That means anxiety does two things at once. It exaggerates danger and shrinks your confidence. So when you trust that gut feeling, you are not just avoiding a perceived threat. You are also reinforcing the belief that you cannot handle discomfort. The brain learns that anxiety equals truth and avoidance equals safety. That lesson gets stronger every time you listen without questioning. Here is the validating part. You are not weak for doing this. Your brain is trying to protect you. Anxiety evolved to keep us alive in uncertain environments, but modern life triggers it constantly. Social situations, decisions, ambition, visibility. These are not mortal threats, but the brain treats them like they are when it is already stressed. Trusting the gut in those moments feels like self-care. In reality, it is often self-limitation. What makes this default especially sticky is that it works in the short term. Avoiding what triggers anxiety brings immediate relief. Your body calms down. The tension drops, and the brain records that as success. It does not care that you avoided something meaningful. It cares that the discomfort stopped. So the next time anxiety shows up, the urge to trust it feels even stronger. Over time, your world shrinks, not because danger increased, but because anxiety gained authority. There is also a memory distortion involved. When you trust an anxious gut feeling and avoid something, you never collect evidence that you could have handled it. So the brain never updates its model. The fear remains hypothetical but convincing. Meanwhile, the few times anxiety coincides with a negative outcome stand out vividly. The brain says, see, the gut was right. It ignores the many times anxiety warned you about things that turned out fine. This selective recall keeps the belief alive. The shift does not come from ignoring gut feelings. It comes from interrogating them, asking, is this calm and clear, or is this urgent and tense? Asking what evidence supports this feeling versus what it is protecting me from feeling. Anxiety wants certainty and safety. Intuition wants alignment and clarity. They feel different in the body when you know how to listen. When you pause, instead of immediately obeying the anxious signal, you give your rational brain time to join the conversation. Often you realize the feeling is about fear of discomfort, not danger. Fear of being seen. Fear of failing. Fear of not being enough. Those fears feel intense, but they are not instructions. They are invitations to slow down, not back away. Once you learn to tell the difference between intuition and anxiety, your gut stops being a dictator and becomes a data point. And that distinction changes which parts of your life anxiety gets to decide for you. Mistaking confidence for competence. There is a moment when someone speaks with certainty and your brain relaxes. They sound sure. They do not hesitate. They do not second guess, and without realizing it, you feel it. This person knows what they are doing. You trust them faster. You defer more easily. Sometimes you even doubt yourself in comparison, not because of what they have demonstrated, but because of how confidently they show up. That reaction feels natural, but it hides something unsettling. The brain is incredibly quick to confuse confidence with competence. When you stop actively evaluating evidence, confidence becomes a shortcut for credibility. The louder, clearer, or more decisive someone sounds, the more capable they seem. And the brain rarely pauses to ask the harder question. Are they actually skilled, or do they just feel certain? This happens because confidence triggers a sense of safety. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. Ambiguity requires effort. A confident presence removes friction. It feels like clarity. The brain prefers clarity, even false clarity, over complexity. So when someone speaks without doubt, your nervous system interprets that as leadership, authority, or expertise. Meanwhile, real competence often comes with nuance, caution, and uncertainty feels weaker, even when it is more honest. Psychology has a name for this effect. It is related to the fluency heuristic. The easier something is to process, the truer it feels. Confident delivery is easier to process than careful explanation. Short answers feel stronger than complex ones. Certainty feels better than probability. So the brain assigns more weight to the confident signal, even if the underlying information is thin or wrong. Think about how this plays out in everyday life. In meetings, the person who speaks first and speaks firmly often sets the direction, even if their idea is flawed. In social situations, the person who seems sure of themselves is assumed to be socially skilled, even if they lack empathy or awareness. Online, the most confident voice spreads the fastest, regardless of accuracy. The brain is not evaluating competence. It is responding to presentation. The shock comes when you realize how often this applies inward, too. You may discount your own abilities because you feel unsure, while overestimating others because they sound sure. You might assume someone else knows better because they hesitate less. Meanwhile, your hesitation may actually come from deeper thinking, from seeing trade-offs, from understanding complexity. But the brain does not reward that when it is tired. It rewards decisiveness. There is also a biological layer here. Confidence reduces perceived threat. When someone appears sure, your brain assumes they have things under control. That lowers anxiety. Competence, on the other hand, takes time to evaluate. It requires observing outcomes, consistency, and skill over time. That takes patience. When cognitive load is high, the brain defaults to the faster signal. Confidence feels like competence because it is quicker to judge. This is why overconfidence can be so persuasive. Research on the Dunning-Kruger effect shows that people with lower ability in a domain often overestimate their competence, while highly skilled individuals are more aware of what they do not know. The less you know, the easier it is to feel certain. The more you know, the more complexity you see. But from the outside, certainty looks impressive and caution looks weak. The brain gets it backward, and this does not just affect who you trust. It affects who you become. When confidence is rewarded more than accuracy, people learn to perform certainty instead of build skill. They speak before they understand. They defend instead of explore. They avoid saying I do not know. Over time, this creates environments where appearance matters more than substance, and where real competence goes quiet because it does not shout. If you have ever stayed silent despite knowing something, because you were not fully sure, you have felt this tension. The brain tells you do not speak until you are confident. But confidence is often the last thing to arrive when you are actually thinking. Real understanding is messy. It involves revision. It involves doubt. The tragedy is that when confidence is mistaken for competence, the people with the most insight are often the least heard. This mental default also shapes how you judge yourself. You may feel incapable not because you lack skill, but because you lack certainty. You may assume you are not ready because you still have questions. But questions are not incompetence. They are evidence of engagement. The brain, however, wants a clean signal. When it does not get one, it assumes deficiency. None of this means confidence is useless. Confidence can be learned. It can support action. It can help communicate ideas. The problem is treating it as proof of ability. Confidence is a style. Competence is a substance. One can exist without the other. When the brain stops distinguishing between them, it hands authority to whoever feels the most sure, not whoever understands the most. The shift begins when you slow your judgments down, when you ask what has this person actually done, not how do they sound. When you notice whether certainty is backed by evidence or just delivery. And inwardly, when you stop equating hesitation with inadequacy. Doubt does not mean you are wrong. Often it means you are thinking. Once you see how easily the brain is impressed by confidence, you start looking past tone and toward substance. And that changes who you trust, who you follow, and how you value your own quiet competence when it does not announce itself loudly. Overestimating how much others are thinking about you. You walk into a room and feel it immediately. A slight self-consciousness, a sense of being seen. Not just noticed, but evaluated. You adjust how you stand. You replay what you said earlier. You wonder if that comment landed weird. And even if no one is staring, no one is reacting, no one is doing anything obvious, your brain acts as if a spotlight just switched on and stayed there, as if everyone else is quietly thinking about you. What is shocking is how automatic this is. You do not choose to believe others are focused on you. It just feels true. The mind fills the silence with imagined judgments. They noticed that mistake. They remember that awkward thing. They are probably forming an opinion right now, and the emotional reaction follows instantly. Tension, self-monitoring, a subtle urge to perform correctly, all because your brain assumed a tension that may not exist. Psychologically, this is called the spotlight effect. It is the tendency to massively overestimate how much others notice and think about you. Studies show that people believe their appearance, actions, and mistakes are far more visible and memorable to others than they actually are. The brain centers you in the story because you are the center of your own experience. Your thoughts, sensations, and emotions are loud. Other people's internal worlds are silent to you, so the brain fills that silence with projection. Here is the unsettling part. Your brain does not just assume others are thinking about you. It assumes they are thinking critically. Neutral attention rarely shows up in this default. The imagined audience is not curious or indifferent. They are judging, measuring, interpreting. That is because the brain evolved to monitor social standing. In early human groups, reputation mattered for survival. Being liked, trusted, and accepted had real consequences, so the brain learned to constantly scan for signs of social evaluation, even when none are present. The problem is that this mechanism did not update for modern life. Today, everyone else is just as absorbed in their own internal monologue as you are. They are worrying about how they look, what they said, what they should do next. Their attention is fragmented, overstimulated, and fleeting. But your brain does not register that. It treats other people as fully focused observers because it has no access to their distraction. Think about how this plays out in small moments. You trip slightly while walking and feel a flush of embarrassment, convinced everyone noticed. You say something and immediately regret it, assuming it will be remembered. You post something online and keep checking reactions, imagining people analyzing it. In reality, most people either did not notice, forgot instantly, or thought about it for a few seconds before returning to their own concerns. But your brain does not record that. It records how intense it felt to you. What makes this default so persistent is emotional memory. You remember how exposed you felt in past moments of embarrassment. The brain stores that feeling as a warning, so the next time you enter a social situation, it preemptively activates self-awareness to protect you. It says, "Be careful, they are watching." Even if they are not. That vigilance feels responsible, but it is often unnecessary. There is also an ego component here that people rarely acknowledge. Overestimating how much others think about you is not always insecurity. Sometimes it is self-importance in disguise. The brain assumes you are a central character in other people's narratives. That assumption is flattering in a strange way, even when it is uncomfortable. Letting go of it requires accepting something humbling. You are not the main focus of most people's attention, and that truth, while initially unsettling, is actually freeing. The cost of this default is constant self-regulation. When you believe others are watching, you monitor yourself excessively. You edit your words. You suppress impulses. You perform versions of yourself instead of relaxing into presence. This drains cognitive energy. It increases anxiety, and it reduces authenticity. You are not responding to the moment. You are managing an imagined audience. Ironically, this can make social connection harder. When you are busy thinking about how you are being perceived, you are less available to perceive others. Conversations become internal performances rather than shared experiences. The brain thinks it is protecting your social standing, but it is actually pulling you out of connection. And again, this is not because you are vain or anxious. It is because your brain uses itself as the reference point for reality. It assumes that what feels loud internally must be loud externally, but internal volume does not translate to external attention. Your embarrassment does not broadcast itself. Your thoughts do not echo in other minds. Most people are too busy managing their own spotlight to stand under yours. The shift begins when you notice how often your self-consciousness spikes without evidence. When you ask, what proof do I have that others are focused on me right now? That question gently breaks the illusion. You start seeing how little feedback you actually receive, how quickly attention moves on, how rarely people bring up your perceived mistakes. The world feels less hostile and more neutral. When you let go of the belief that you are constantly being observed, something surprising happens. You relax, you speak more freely, you take up space more naturally. Not because you stopped caring what people think, but because you stopped assuming they are thinking. Turning one bad moment into a permanent identity. It usually starts with a single moment, one mistake, one awkward comment, one failure that lands heavier than you expected, and before the moment even fully passes, something inside you hardens around it. Not just embarrassment, not just regret, but a conclusion about who you are. I am careless. I am bad at this. I always ruin things. The moment ends, but the label stays. Quietly, permanently, as if that one snapshot now defines the whole person. The shock is not that the brain remembers mistakes. It is that it turns them into identity so fast. Instead of saying that was a bad moment, the mind says this is who I am. That shift happens almost instantly, especially when the moment triggers shame. Shame is a powerful emotion because it does not say something went wrong. It says something is wrong with you. And once shame enters the picture, the brain stops evaluating behavior and starts rewriting the self. Neurologically, this makes sense. The brain is a pattern-making machine. It looks for consistency because consistency makes the world predictable. When something emotionally intense happens, the brain searches for a stable explanation. A one-time error feels unstable, an identity feels solid. So the brain locks onto the most available explanation, you. It is simpler to believe I am this way than to hold the discomfort of randomness, context, or bad timing. This is especially true for moments witnessed by others. Social mistakes light up the same brain regions associated with physical pain. Being seen failing feels threatening to belonging, and because belonging is a survival need, the brain overcorrects. It marks the moment as important. It replays it, and then it generalizes it. That way, it believes it can prevent it from happening again. The intention is protection. The outcome is self-imprisonment. Think about how often this shows up. You stumble during a presentation and decide you are not a confident speaker. You get emotional once and conclude you are too sensitive. You miss a deadline and label yourself unreliable. The brain takes a single data point and stretches it across time. Past, present, future. It forgets every moment that contradicts the label and highlights the one that supports it. That is not honesty. That is emotional bias. What makes this default so convincing is memory distortion. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. Each time you replay the bad moment, it becomes more central, more symbolic, more defining. Other moments fade. Context drops away. The mistake grows larger than it was. Eventually, you stop remembering what happened and start remembering what it says about you. The moment becomes a story. The story becomes identity. There is also a control illusion here. If you believe the bad moment reveals who you are, then the world feels predictable. Pain has a reason. Failure has an explanation. The alternative is harder, accepting that good people mess up, that competent people fail, that awkward moments happen without meaning anything permanent. The brain prefers a harsh certainty over a soft uncertainty, even when that certainty hurts. The cost of this habit is enormous. When you turn one moment into identity, you carry it into every new situation. You hesitate. You self-censor. You brace for confirmation. And because you expect the label to be true, you act in ways that reinforce it. Confidence drops. Presence fades. Performance suffers. Then the brain says, "See, I was right." The identity tightens. What started as one moment becomes a self-fulfilling loop. And this does not just apply to negative traits. It can freeze growth. If you decide you are not creative because one idea failed, you stop exploring. If you decide you are bad with people because one interaction went poorly, you withdraw. The brain confuses a snapshot with a trajectory. It treats a chapter like a conclusion. This pattern often forms early. Many people learned that mistakes led to judgment, withdrawal, or punishment. So the brain adapted by internalizing the judgment first. If I label myself, maybe I can avoid being surprised by criticism. Self-labeling becomes a defense. But defenses built on shame eventually turn inward and limit possibility. The shift begins when you separate behavior from identity. When you say something like "that moment was real, but it was not a definition." That sentence sounds simple, but neurologically it is powerful. It stops the brain from overgeneralizing. It forces it to treat the event as data, not destiny. Data can be used. Destiny cannot. You can also notice the language your mind uses. Always. Never. That is just how I am. Those phrases signal that the brain has crossed from observation into identity. Catching that shift matters more than correcting the thought. Awareness alone loosens the grip. When you look closely, you realize most people are walking around carrying identities built from their worst moments, not their full range of behavior. They are living under labels that formed during stress, not truth. And the moment you see that, something changes. The bad moment shrinks back to its actual size. A moment. Once you stop letting single moments decide who you are, you reclaim the ability to update, to grow, to let today count more than yesterday. And that is not denial. That is accuracy. Because no single moment ever had the authority to define an entire person in the first place. Believing effort is pointless if results aren't immediate. There is a quiet moment when motivation collapses. You try, you show up, you put in effort, and nothing obvious happens. No reward, no visible progress, no confirmation that what you are doing is working. And almost instantly, a thought creeps in that feels painfully logical. What is the point? If this mattered, I would see results by now. The energy drains out of your body, not because you are lazy, but because your brain just decided the effort was wasted. What is shocking is how fast the brain makes that call. It does not wait for long-term patterns. It does not zoom out. It looks for immediate feedback, and when it does not find it, it assumes failure. This is not a character flaw. It is a default setting. The brain is wired to associate effort with quick payoff because, historically, effort without reward was dangerous. Burning energy without results could mean starvation or exposure, so the brain learned a rule. If nothing happens soon, stop. The problem is that most meaningful things in modern life do not follow that rule. Learning, healing, building skill, changing habits, strengthening relationships. None of these offer instant evidence that your effort is paying off. Progress happens quietly, beneath the surface, before it ever shows up externally. But the brain does not register invisible change. It only trusts what it can see. So when results lag behind effort, the brain fills the gap with a discouraging conclusion. This is not working. Psychologically, this ties into something called temporal discounting. The brain heavily favors immediate rewards over delayed ones. A small reward now feels more valuable than a larger reward later. When effort does not come with immediate payoff, it feels unrewarded, even if it is building something substantial over time. That lack of dopamine feedback makes the effort feel pointless. Motivation is not just about discipline. It is about the brain feeling reinforced. Think about how this plays out. You start exercising but do not see changes right away, so you assume your body is not responding. You work on a skill but still feel awkward, so you decide you are not improving. You communicate differently in a relationship but do not see instant change, so you give up. In each case, the brain treats delay as evidence. No result yet must mean no result ever. What makes this default so convincing is that it feels realistic. It sounds like common sense. If something worked, I would see it. But that logic only applies to short feedback loops. It completely breaks down for complex systems. Growth is not linear. It is cumulative. Early effort often goes into building foundations, not producing visible outcomes. The brain, however, cannot feel foundations, so it labels the effort inefficient. There is also an emotional layer here. Waiting for results creates vulnerability. You are investing without proof. You are tolerating uncertainty. That is uncomfortable. Deciding effort is pointless gives you an exit. It protects you from the pain of hoping longer. Quitting early feels like regaining control. The brain prefers the certainty of stopping to the ambiguity of continuing. But here is the hidden cost. When you repeatedly stop effort because results are not immediate, the brain learns a dangerous lesson. Persistence does not pay. That belief then generalizes. You become less willing to invest in anything that does not reward you quickly. Patience shrinks. Frustration tolerance drops. Long-term goals start feeling unrealistic, not because they are, but because your brain has not stayed long enough to see delayed payoff before. Neuroscience shows that skill acquisition and habit change involve delayed neurological rewiring. The brain strengthens connections slowly through repetition. Early on, performance feels effortful and inconsistent. That does not mean you are failing. It means your nervous system is still learning. But without understanding that process, the brain mislabels the discomfort of early stages as inefficiency. It says this should be easier by now, which is almost always false. There is also a memory bias involved. You tend to remember moments when effort paid off quickly and forget the long stretches where nothing seemed to happen before a breakthrough. The brain rewrites success stories as faster than they were. That distortion makes your current slow progress feel abnormal, even though it is actually typical. The validating part is this: feeling discouraged when results are delayed does not mean you lack grit. It means your brain is craving feedback. Humans are feedback-driven creatures. When feedback disappears, motivation suffers. The solution is not forcing yourself harder. It is understanding that lack of visible results does not equal lack of progress. The shift begins when you redefine what counts as evidence. Instead of asking, "Is this working yet?" you ask, "Am I doing the behavior consistently?" You move the measurement from outcome to process. That gives the brain something concrete to register. Consistency becomes the signal instead of results. Over time, this retrains your nervous system to tolerate delay without interpreting it as failure. When you stick with effort long enough, something surprising happens. Results eventually show up, but they often arrive suddenly after a long period of apparent nothing. The brain then retroactively understands the value of persistence, but that lesson only forms if you stay past the quiet phase. Most people quit right before the curve turns upward, not because they were incapable, but because their brain mistook silence for futility. Once you see how often your motivation collapses, not from lack of ability, but from lack of immediate reinforcement, you start treating that impulse with more skepticism. You stop asking, "Why is this not working yet?" and start asking, "What phase am I in?" And that question alone keeps you in the game long enough for effort to actually become results. Assuming intent behind neutral actions, you notice it in the smallest moments. A short reply, a neutral look. Someone walks past without acknowledging you, and before your mind even catches up, a meaning snaps into place. They are annoyed. They are being passive-aggressive. They do not respect you. Nothing overt happened. No words were spoken. But your brain confidently assigns intent anyway, as if it uncovered a hidden message beneath the surface. The shocking part is how certain this feels. You do not think, "Maybe this means something." You think this means something. The interpretation arrives fully formed, emotionally loaded, and convincing. Your body reacts as if the intent were confirmed. A flush of irritation, a dip of self-doubt, a spike of defensiveness, all triggered by an action that, on its own, carried no clear meaning at all. This happens because the brain is allergic to ambiguity, especially in social situations. Humans are wired to read intent because intent once mattered more than outcome. In early social groups, misreading someone's motives could mean conflict, exclusion, or danger. So the brain evolved to constantly infer what others are thinking and why they are acting a certain way. The problem is that modern life is full of neutral behaviors that have nothing to do with you, but the brain still treats them like clues. When information is missing, the brain fills it in, and it rarely fills it in neutrally. It uses your emotional state, your past experiences, and your insecurities as raw material. If you are already stressed, neutral actions look hostile. If you are feeling unsure, they look judgmental. If you are feeling disconnected, they look dismissive. The intent you assume often says more about your internal state than the other person's. Psychologically, this is a mix of mind reading and attribution bias. The brain assumes that other people's actions are driven by stable traits or deliberate motives, rather than situational factors. If someone is quiet, they must be upset. If they are brief, they must be annoyed. If they do not respond right away, They must be ignoring you on purpose. The brain skips over dozens of neutral explanations because intent feels more informative than circumstance. Think about how often this shows up. A coworker gives minimal feedback, and you assume they disapprove. A friend cancels plans, and you assume they did not really want to see you. Someone forgets to follow up, and you decide they do not care. None of these interpretations required confirmation. They were emotional guesses that felt like conclusions. What makes this default especially dangerous is how quickly it escalates. Once you assume intent, you start reacting to it. You become colder, sharper, more withdrawn, or overly accommodating. You adjust your behavior based on a story that may not be true. And then the other person responds to your changed behavior, not the original situation. Suddenly, the interaction feels tense or distant, and your brain says, "See, I was right." The assumed intent becomes self-validating. There is also a control illusion baked into this. Assigning intent gives the brain a sense of understanding. Neutral actions are open-ended. They require patience. Assuming intent closes the loop. It gives you a reason. Even if that reason hurts, it feels better than not knowing. The brain prefers a painful explanation over no explanation at all, because explanation feels like control. This habit is especially strong when there is emotional history involved. If you have been dismissed before, you are more likely to interpret neutrality as dismissal. If you have been criticized before, you are more likely to hear judgment in silence. The brain uses past patterns to predict current meaning. That can be useful. But when overused, it turns neutral reality into a constant threat assessment. And again, this is not because you are paranoid or overly sensitive. It is because your brain is doing social math at high speed. It is trying to protect you from being blindsided. The issue is not that the brain reads intent. It is that it does so without verifying accuracy. It treats assumptions as facts and moves on. The emotional toll of this is subtle but exhausting. When you assume intent behind neutral actions, you live in a state of quiet vigilance. You are always decoding, interpreting, bracing. Interactions feel heavier than they need to be. Relationships feel fragile. You spend mental energy responding to meanings that were never actually sent. The shift starts when you slow the process down just enough to notice the leap. The moment you feel a reaction, you ask, what did they actually do versus what am I assuming it means? That question separates observation from interpretation. Often, you realize the action itself was minimal, while the meaning you assigned was loaded. This does not mean you ignore red flags or dismiss your feelings. It means you stop treating every ambiguous cue as intentional communication. Neutral behavior is common. People are distracted, tired, focused elsewhere, operating from their own internal world. Most actions are not messages. They are just actions. When you practice leaving intent undecided until there is evidence, something changes. Your nervous system relaxes. You respond instead of react. You give people room to clarify through behavior over time, rather than locking them into a story based on a single moment. Conversations feel lighter. Misunderstandings decrease. And you stop carrying emotional weight that was never actually handed to you. Once you realize how often your brain assigns intent simply to escape uncertainty, you start holding those interpretations more loosely. You let neutral stay neutral long, replaying the same negative memory as if it's new. It sneaks up on you when you are not expecting it. You are doing something ordinary, driving, showering, lying in bed, and suddenly a memory drops into your mind like it just happened. Your stomach tightens. Your face heats up. your thoughts spiral. Even though the event is old, your body reacts as if it is happening right now. Not remembered, re-experienced. What is shocking is how fresh it feels. The tone of voice, the look on someone's face, the exact moment you wish you had said something different. Your brain does not label it as the past. It treats it as current input. And because the emotional reaction is real and immediate, it convinces you that the memory still matters just as much as it did the first time, maybe even more. This happens because the brain does not store memories like files in a cabinet. It stores them as patterns of neural activation. When a memory is emotionally charged, especially with shame, regret, or fear, the brain wires it deeply. Each time you recall it, you are not just accessing it. You are reactivating it, and reactivation makes it feel present. The nervous system cannot tell the difference between something happening now and something vividly imagined, so it responds the same way. Here is the part most people do not realize. Every time you replay the memory, you strengthen it. Neuroscience shows that memory reconsolidation occurs each time a memory is recalled. That means the memory is temporarily malleable, then stored again. If you replay it with the same emotional charge, you reinforce both the details and the distress. The brain learns this is important. Keep it accessible. Bring it up often. That is why the same memory keeps returning, not because it is unresolved in some mystical way, but because your brain has been trained to treat it as urgent. It thinks replay equals problem solving. It thinks if we look at this again, maybe we can prevent it from happening in the future. But most of the time, nothing new is being learned. The replay is identical. Same images, same conclusions, same self-judgment. The brain is burning energy without gaining insight. Think about how this shows up. You remember something embarrassing from years ago and feel a wave of shame like it just occurred. You recall a mistake and immediately start criticizing yourself in the present tense. You relive an argument and feel anger rise in your body all over again. Objectively, nothing is happening. Subjectively, everything is happening. What makes this default so powerful is that it feels productive. The brain tells you this is reflection. This is learning. This is accountability. But reflection involves distance. Learning involves change. When you replay the same memory without new perspective, it is not growth. It is rumination. And rumination convinces you that the past is unfinished business, even when there is nothing left to do. There is also a time distortion here. When the memory feels new, it feels relevant. And when it feels relevant, your brain treats it as a current threat to your identity or safety. That keeps stress hormones elevated. Over time, this can create a baseline of anxiety or low mood that seems to come from nowhere. In reality, your nervous system is repeatedly reliving old emotional injuries as if they are ongoing. This pattern is especially common with shame-based memories. Shame sticks because it attacks the self, not just the situation. The brain replays these moments to try to protect you from repeating them. But instead of extracting a simple lesson and letting go, it replays the emotional pain. The lesson was learned the first time. The replay is just the brain checking the scar again and again. And again, this does not mean you are broken or stuck. It means your brain is doing what it does when it feels responsible for preventing future harm. Equating discomfort with danger, your body tightens and your brain jumps to a conclusion before you even realize it. Something feels uncomfortable, awkward, unfamiliar. Your heart rate shifts, your chest feels tight, and instantly a message flashes through your nervous system. This is not safe. Pull back. Stop, get out. The feeling itself becomes the warning, even though nothing objectively dangerous is happening. What is shocking is how convincing this feels. Discomfort does not show up gently. It arrives with physical signals that are hard to ignore. Sweaty palms, shallow breathing, a knot in your stomach. Those sensations evolved to protect you from real threats, so your brain treats them seriously. It does not pause to ask why you feel this way. It assumes the feeling means danger and moves straight into avoidance mode. By the time logic tries to step in, the decision has already been made. Here is where the brain quietly gets it wrong. Discomfort and danger use the same alarm system, but they are not the same thing. The nervous system does not differentiate between physical threat and emotional unfamiliarity very well. Novelty, uncertainty, social exposure, and growth all trigger the same stress response as actual risk. The amygdala fires, cortisol rises, and the body prepares to protect itself. That reaction made sense when discomfort often did signal danger. In modern life, it usually signals learning. Think about how this shows up. You feel uncomfortable speaking up, so you assume something bad will happen if you do. You feel uneasy starting something new, so you decide it is not right for you. You feel tension in a social situation, so you conclude you do not belong there. In each case, the brain takes the sensation of discomfort and treats it as evidence. Not evidence of difficulty, but evidence of threat. The shock comes when you realize how much of your life is shaped by this misinterpretation. Opportunities disappear not because they are unsafe, but because they feel unfamiliar. Conversations do not happen because they feel awkward. Growth stalls because the early stages feel clumsy and exposed. The brain calls this self-protection. In reality, it is mislabeling. Neuroscience explains why this happens. The brain prioritizes false positives over false negatives. It would rather warn you when there is no danger than miss a real one. So the threshold for triggering the alarm is low. Emotional discomfort easily crosses it, especially if you are already stressed, tired, or uncertain. When the alarm goes off, your thinking brain gets less access. Blood flow shifts. Attention narrows. The urge to escape feels urgent and rational. What makes this default so powerful is that it feels responsible. Avoiding discomfort feels like good judgment. You tell yourself you are listening to your body, trusting your instincts, being cautious. But instincts evolved to keep you alive, not to help you grow. They are excellent at detecting threat. They are terrible at distinguishing between danger and challenge. The validating part is this. Your body is not broken for reacting this way. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Discomfort feels intense because it is supposed to get your attention. The mistake is assuming that intensity equals importance, or that fear equals truth. The body is signaling activation, not prediction. Here is where the cost becomes clear. When you equate discomfort with danger, you start building a life optimized for comfort rather than alignment. You avoid the conversations that matter. You stay in situations that feel familiar, even when they no longer fit. You shrink your range of experience to keep your nervous system calm. Short term, that feels soothing. Long term, it feels like stagnation. There is also a learning consequence. The only way the brain updates its threat model is through experience. If you always retreat when discomfort appears, the brain never learns that the situation was survivable. So the alarm stays loud. Each time you avoid, you reinforce the belief that discomfort was something you needed protection from. The next time it shows up, the reaction is even stronger. The comfort zone tightens. This is why anxiety can quietly grow without obvious cause. It is not that danger increased. It is that tolerance for discomfort decreased. The brain learned that feeling uneasy means stop. Over time, more and more situations trigger the same response. The shift begins when you ask a different question. Not does this feel comfortable, but is this actually dangerous? That question sounds simple, but it changes everything. It forces the brain to separate sensation from meaning. You start noticing that many uncomfortable moments pass without harm. The conversation ends. Treating thoughts as facts instead of mental events, a thought appears in your mind and it lands with weight. Not like an idea you can examine, but like a statement carved in stone. I am failing. This is not going to work. They do not like me. And without realizing it, you treat that thought as a report from reality instead of what it actually is. A mental event passing through consciousness. The moment it shows up, your body reacts as if it were confirmed truth. Your mood shifts. Your behavior changes. Your options narrow. All because a sentence formed in your head. The shock is not that thoughts appear. Thoughts appear constantly. The shock is how rarely we question their authority. The brain presents them in the first person with emotional force and without disclaimers. There is no label that says this is just a thought, so the mind assumes it must be accurate. After all, why would it think something that is not true? That assumption alone gives thoughts enormous power over how you feel and what you do. Neuroscience makes this even more unsettling. The brain generates thousands of thoughts a day automatically. Most of them are not deliberate. They are produced by pattern recognition systems that are constantly scanning for meaning, threat, and prediction. Thoughts are guesses. They are hypotheses. They are attempts to make sense of incomplete information. But when you are tired, stressed, or emotionally activated, the brain skips evaluation and moves straight to belief. The thought feels real, so it must be real. This is especially true for negative thoughts. The brain has a negativity bias. It treats negative information as more important than neutral or positive information. So when a self-critical or catastrophic thought appears, it gets priority processing. Your attention locks onto it. Your nervous system responds, and suddenly you are living inside a story that may not reflect reality at all. But from the inside, it feels like insight, like honesty, like facing facts. Think about how often this shows up. You think I am not good enough and your confidence drops instantly. You think something bad is going to happen and your anxiety spikes. You think they are judging me and you withdraw. In each case, the thought did not describe reality. It created your experience of it. But because the reaction was emotional and physical, the brain took that as confirmation. See, it hurts, so it must be true. Psychology calls this cognitive fusion. It is when you fuse with your thoughts and experience them as reality instead of mental activity. When fusion happens, there is no space between you and the thought. You are not observing it. You are inside it, and from that position, questioning feels impossible. You do not ask, is this accurate? You ask, what should I do about this? The assumption of truth comes first. What makes this default so convincing is how familiar it feels. You have been thinking your whole life. Thoughts have guided decisions, solved problems, kept you safe. So the brain learns to trust them by default. But there is a crucial difference between thoughts that are tested and thoughts that are automatic. Automatic thoughts are fast, emotionally charged, and often based on past experiences rather than present facts. They are efficient, not precise. There is also an identity layer here. When a thought starts with I am or I always or I never, it feels personal. Challenging it feels like denying yourself. So instead of questioning the thought, you accept it and adjust your behavior to match it. You play smaller. You avoid risk. You brace for rejection. Over time, the thought feels increasingly true because your life starts to reflect it. Not because it was accurate, but because it guided your actions. And again, this is not because you are naive or unself-aware. It is because the brain evolved to treat internal signals as meaningful. In the wild, ignoring your own thoughts could be dangerous, but modern minds generate far more noise than signal. Not every thought deserves belief. Some deserve curiosity. Some deserve dismissal. Some deserve a raised eyebrow. The cost of treating thoughts as facts is living reactively. Your emotional state rises and falls based on defaulting to habits instead of conscious choices. You do not decide most of your day. It decides you. You wake up and reach for your phone without thinking. You eat the same things, take the same routes, react the same way to the same triggers. Hours pass and at the end you feel oddly absent from your own life. Nothing went wrong exactly, but nothing felt chosen either. The shocking part is not that habits exist. Habits are useful. The shock is how completely they take over when conscious attention drops even slightly. The moment your mind gets tired, stressed, or overloaded, it hands control to whatever pattern is already installed. And once that happens, choice quietly disappears. You are still moving, still doing, but you are no longer deciding. This happens because the brain is obsessed with efficiency. Conscious choice is expensive. It burns energy. It requires attention, evaluation, and effort. Habits are cheap. They run automatically in the background. From the brain's perspective, habits are a win. They free up resources. So whenever the brain senses low energy or emotional load, it defaults to the familiar loop. Not the best option, not the most aligned one, just the most rehearsed. Neurologically, habits live in a different system than conscious decisions. They are stored in procedural memory, which means they can run without awareness. That is why you can drive somewhere and barely remember the trip. Your brain delegated the task. The problem is that this delegation does not stop at neutral behaviors. It also applies to emotional reactions, coping strategies, and self-talk. You do not just habitually brush your teeth. You habitually avoid conflict, habitually procrastinate, habitually self-criticize. Think about how often this shows up. You automatically say yes even when you want to say no. You scroll when you feel bored or uncomfortable. You snap defensively when you feel challenged. You promise yourself you will respond differently next time. And then next time comes and the same pattern runs again. It feels like a failure of willpower. It is not. It is a failure of awareness in the moment when choice was possible. What makes this default so sneaky is that habits feel like you. They feel natural. You do not experience them as a program running. You experience them as your personality. I am just like this. This is how I react. This is how I unwind. But most of these patterns were not chosen intentionally. They were built through repetition, convenience, and emotional relief. The brain noticed what reduced discomfort quickly and installed it. The validating truth is this: your brain is not trying to sabotage you. It is trying to conserve energy and protect you from uncertainty. Conscious choice means stepping into the unknown. Habits keep things predictable. Even bad habits are predictable, and predictability feels safe to the nervous system. So when life feels demanding, the brain tightens its grip on the familiar. The cost of this default is subtle but enormous. When habits run unchecked, your life becomes a replay. Days blur together. You feel stuck without knowing why. You want change, but your behavior keeps reinforcing the same outcomes. And because habits operate below awareness, it feels like change should be harder than it actually is. You think you need more discipline, more motivation, more force. What you actually need is more presence at the right moments. There is also an identity trap here. When you default to habits long enough, you start defining yourself by them. I am lazy. I am reactive. I am bad with follow-through. Those labels feel accurate because the behavior is consistent. But the consistency is not character. It is conditioning, and conditioning can be interrupted. The shift begins when you realize that choice does not require changing your whole life. It only requires interrupting the automatic pilot for a few seconds at a time. Habits are strongest at the beginning of a behavior loop. The urge, the impulse, the familiar pull. That is where awareness matters. Not hours later. Not in reflection. In the moment when the body is about to move on its own. When you notice the urge and pause, even briefly, you create a gap. In that gap, choice becomes possible. You might still do the habit. That is fine. The win is not perfection. The win is consciousness. Each time you notice, you weaken the automaticity slightly. The brain learns that delegation is no longer guaranteed. Over time, something interesting happens. You start feeling more present in small moments. Eating feels deliberate. Responses feel intentional. Even when you repeat an old habit, it feels chosen rather than compulsive. That alone restores a sense of agency. You stop feeling like life is happening to you. This does not mean you eliminate habits. You refine them. You decide which ones deserve to stay and which ones do not. You replace default reactions with intentional ones. Not by force, but by attention. Attention is the currency of change. Wherever it goes, behavior follows. Once you see how often your life runs on autopilot, you stop blaming yourself for being stuck. You realize you were just absent at the wrong moments. And when presence returns, even briefly, choice returns with it. That is when your life stops feeling repetitive and starts feeling authored again. Expecting consistency from people who have shown none. They show up strong one day, warm, engaged, full of promises, and your brain locks onto that version of them. So when they disappear the next day, cancel last minute, change their tone, or contradict themselves, you do not update your expectations. You wait. You explain it away. You assume the consistent version is the real one and everything else is just noise. The shocking part is how reasonable this feels. After all, consistency is what we expect from stable people. So your mind keeps trying to anchor to the moments that fit that expectation. You remember what they said they wanted, how they acted when things were good, how convincing it felt at the time, and you treat inconsistency as an exception instead of the pattern it actually is. This happens because the brain hates unpredictability in relationships. Uncertainty is stressful. Not knowing what to expect keeps the nervous system on edge. So the mind tries to resolve that discomfort by creating a stable story. It chooses a version of the person and assumes that is who they really are. The rest gets labeled as temporary, circumstantial, or misunderstood. Psychologically, this is driven by pattern completion. When the brain gets partial information, it fills in the rest based on what feels most coherent. If someone has shown you flashes of reliability or care, your brain uses those flashes to complete the picture. It assumes continuity that has not been earned. This is not optimism. It is a need for predictability. Think about how this plays out. Someone repeatedly lets you down, but every time they do something kind, it resets your hope. A coworker is unreliable, but the one time they follow through, you assume things have changed. A partner sends mixed signals, but you cling to the moments of clarity as proof of intent. Each time inconsistency shows up, you pause your judgment instead of updating it. What makes this default especially painful is that it turns waiting into a strategy. You wait for them to become the version you believe exists. You wait for consistency to arrive because you have already decided it should be there. And while you wait, you keep adjusting yourself, being more patient, more understanding, less demanding. You carry the emotional labor of stabilizing something that has never been stable. The validating truth is this: your brain is not foolish for doing this. It is relationally wired. Humans evolved to depend on others, so the mind is biased toward preserving connection. It will rationalize inconsistency if it means maintaining a bond, especially if the relationship once felt safe or meaningful. Letting go of that expectation feels like losing the relationship entirely. There is also a sunk cost effect at work. The more time and energy you have invested, the harder it is to accept the data in front of you. Your brain tells you that if you just wait a little longer, things will settle. That all relationships have ups and downs. That consistency will come if you are patient enough. Those thoughts soften the discomfort of the present, but they keep you stuck. Here is where the cost becomes clear. When you expect consistency from someone who has not demonstrated it, you constantly miscalibrate your behavior. You plan based on promises instead of patterns. You trust words over actions. You set yourself up for repeated disappointment, then blame yourself for being hurt. Each letdown feels personal, even though the evidence was there all along. Over time, this erodes self-trust. You start doubting your own perceptions. You tell yourself you are overreacting, too sensitive, too demanding. Instead of adjusting your expectations of them, you adjust your standards for yourself. That is how inconsistency becomes normalized. The brain also confuses potential with probability. Just because someone could be consistent does not mean they will be. Potential is an imagined future. Probability is based on past behavior. When you stop thinking consciously, the brain defaults to potential because it feels hopeful. Probability feels cold, but probability is what protects you. The shift begins when you stop asking who could this person be and start asking who have they consistently shown themselves to be. Not once, not when things were easy, under pressure, when it mattered. Consistency is not about perfection. It is about reliability, and reliability leaves a trail. This does not mean you cut people off at the first misstep. It means you update expectations in real time. You stop lending certainty where there is none. You plan with. Assuming change is harder than it actually is. Most people do not avoid change because they do not want it. They avoid it because their brain has already decided it will be exhausting, overwhelming, and probably pointless. Before you even try, a quiet conclusion settles in. This will take forever. This will require more discipline than I have. This will disrupt everything. So you postpone, you downplay the desire. You tell yourself now is not the right time, and the decision feels rational. The shocking part is that this belief rarely comes from experience. It comes from prediction. The brain simulates change as a massive, all-consuming effort, even when the actual steps would be small. It imagines total transformation instead of incremental movement. And because the imagined version feels heavy, the brain labels change as hard before you have taken a single step. This happens because the brain is not great at imagining gradual processes. It prefers snapshots. So when you think about changing a habit, a job, a relationship dynamic, or your health, the brain jumps straight to the end state. New routines, new identity, new expectations. That imagined future feels far away and demanding, so your nervous system reacts with resistance. Not because the change itself is impossible, but because the mental simulation is exaggerated. Neuroscience helps explain this. The brain overestimates effort when outcomes are uncertain. When it cannot predict a clear reward timeline, it assumes high cost. That is a protective bias. It keeps you from wasting energy. The problem is that most meaningful changes do not provide immediate feedback. The benefits are delayed, subtle at first, so the brain fills in the gap by assuming the worst case in terms of effort. Think about how this shows up. You want to exercise, but your mind jumps to months of discomfort. You want to speak up more, but you imagine endless anxiety. You want to change your routine, but you picture your whole life needing to be reorganized. None of those predictions are precise. They are vague, heavy, and emotionally charged. And because they feel convincing, you treat them as facts. What makes this default especially limiting is that it steals momentum before it exists. You do not fail at change. You never start. And because you never start, the belief that change is hard never gets challenged. It becomes part of your identity. I am bad at sticking to things. I never follow through. Change just is not my strength. Those statements feel true because the data set is empty. The validating truth is this: your brain is not lazy, it is cautious. Change introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty activates the same systems as threat. The brain prefers known discomfort over unknown improvement. Even if the current situation is unsatisfying, it is predictable. Predictability calms the nervous system. Change does not. So the brain inflates the difficulty to justify staying put. There is also a memory distortion at play. When you recall past attempts at change, your brain remembers the hardest parts most vividly. The frustration, the slip-ups, the moments you felt discouraged. It does not equally remember the small wins or the periods where things felt manageable. So when you think about changing again, your brain pulls up a highlight reel of struggle and uses it as evidence. Here is the part that quietly undermines this belief. Change is rarely hard in the way the brain imagines. It is usually awkward, uneven, and surprisingly small. Most changes do not require constant effort. They require brief moments of conscious interruption, a pause, a different choice once or twice a day. The brain imagines marathon-level exertion when the reality is often a few seconds of discomfort repeated over time. Behavioral science shows that consistency matters more than intensity. Tiny changes, when repeated, rewire neural pathways. The brain adapts quickly to new patterns once they are installed. What feels effortful at first becomes automatic faster than expected. But because the brain is predicting from the starting line, it assumes the effort level will stay the same. It does not account for adaptation. The cost of assuming change is harder than it shows up as stagnation. You stay in situations longer than necessary. You tolerate patterns that drain you. You delay improvements that would compound quickly. And because time passes anyway, The cost of not changing quietly grows larger than the cost of changing ever was. The shift begins when you stop asking, "Can I change this?" and start asking, "What is the smallest version of this change I could try today?" That question bypasses the brain's exaggeration. It brings the task into the present. Instead of imagining a new life, you imagine one, letting mood determine beliefs about reality. Your mood shifts and suddenly the world looks different. Not subtly, completely. When you feel low, everything feels pointless. When you feel anxious, everything feels threatening. When you feel irritated, people seem incompetent or disrespectful. Nothing about the external situation actually changed, yet your beliefs about reality did, and it feels logical. It feels accurate. It feels like you are seeing things clearly for the first time. The shocking part is how invisible this process is. You do not think, "I am in a bad mood, so my thoughts are distorted." You think this is just how things are. The mood arrives first, quietly alters perception, and then your mind builds explanations to justify it. Those explanations feel like insight, not bias. And because they match how you feel, they seem undeniably true. This happens because emotions are not just feelings. They are information signals. The brain evolved to use mood as a shortcut for interpreting the environment. If you feel good, the environment is likely safe. If you feel bad, something must be wrong. That system worked well when emotions were tightly linked to immediate circumstances. In modern life, moods are often influenced by sleep, hormones, stress, blood sugar, unresolved memories, or a dozen other factors that have nothing to do with what is actually happening right now. Psychology calls this mood congruent thinking. When you are in a certain emotional state, your brain selectively retrieves thoughts, memories, and interpretations that match it. In a low mood, your mind finds evidence that supports hopeless beliefs. In an anxious mood, it finds reasons to worry. The brain is not lying. It is filtering. And because the filter is active below awareness, the resulting picture feels complete. Think about how often this shows up. You wake up feeling off, and suddenly your life feels wrong. Your job feels meaningless. Your relationships feel strained. Your future feels bleak. Later, after rest or connection or time passes, the same life looks tolerable again. Nothing external changed. Only the mood did. Yet, while you were in it, the conclusions felt absolute. What makes this default so powerful is that mood-based beliefs feel honest. You tell yourself you are just being realistic, that you are finally seeing things without illusions. Especially when the mood is negative. There is a cultural bias that sadness equals depth and pessimism equals truth. So when you feel down and start believing bleak things about yourself or the world, it feels mature, not distorted. The validating truth is this: your brain is not broken for doing this. It is doing what it evolved to do. Emotions prepare the body for action. They influence attention, memory, and interpretation to match the assumed context. The problem is that the assumed context is often wrong. The brain treats internal state as evidence about external reality. Here is where the cost becomes real. When you let mood determine beliefs, your sense of reality becomes unstable. Decisions made in one mood contradict decisions made in another. You make promises you cannot keep when you feel good. You make harsh judgments you would never endorse when you feel calm. Over time, you stop trusting yourself because your beliefs keep shifting. There is also an identity impact. If you repeatedly believe negative things when you feel low, those beliefs start to stick. Even when the mood lifts, a residue remains. The brain remembers the conclusions more than the emotional state that produced them. So temporary moods create long-term narratives. I am not capable. Things never work out. People cannot be relied on. Those beliefs feel earned, but they were mood-dependent. This is especially dangerous because moods are cyclical. Everyone has fluctuations. If every low mood convinces you that something is fundamentally wrong, you end up constantly trying to fix problems that only exist in that emotional state. You analyze your life when your perception is at its least reliable, and then you wonder why clarity never lasts. The shift begins when you learn to separate feeling from believing. Feeling is real. Believing does not have to be automatic. You can acknowledge I feel hopeless without concluding things are hopeless. That distinction creates space. It allows the emotion to exist without letting it rewrite your understanding of reality. This does not mean you ignore emotions. Emotions matter. They point to needs. But they are not judges. They are weather, not the landscape. When you treat mood as information about your internal state rather than facts about the world, its influence softens. One practical change: believing productivity equals self-worth. You feel it the moment you slow down. A strange tension, a subtle guilt, like you are doing something wrong by not doing enough. When you are busy, you feel valuable. When you are productive, you feel justified. But when you rest, hesitate, or fall behind, something inside you starts questioning your worth. Not your efficiency, your worth. The shocking part is how normal this feels. Society praises output constantly. What do you do? What are you working on? What did you accomplish today? Over time, your brain starts answering a deeper question with the same metric. Am I enough? And the answer becomes conditional. Only if I am producing. Only if I am progressing. Only if I am useful. This belief forms quietly. It does not announce itself. It builds through reinforcement. Praise for achievement. Validation for hustle. Attention for results. The brain learns a simple equation. Doing more equals being more. So when productivity drops, the nervous system does not just register a change in pace. It registers a threat to identity. That is why rest can feel uncomfortable instead of restorative. Psychologically, this is a form of conditional self-regard. Your sense of value depends on meeting certain standards. Productivity becomes the most socially rewarded standard, so it gets elevated above others. Kindness, presence, curiosity, those do not show up on a checklist. Output does. So the brain grabs onto it as proof of worth. Think about how this shows up. You push through exhaustion because stopping feels like failure. You feel anxious on days off because you are not earning your keep. You measure your day not by how you felt, but by how much you got done. And when you fall short, the inner dialogue turns harsh. Lazy, behind, not enough. The judgment feels moral, not practical. What makes this default especially damaging is that it disguises itself as motivation. You tell yourself this pressure is what keeps you moving, that without it you would stagnate. But motivation fueled by self-worth is fragile. It works only as long as you can keep producing. The moment life interrupts, illness, burnout, uncertainty, your self-image takes the hit. Neuroscience adds another layer. When productivity becomes tied to self-worth, the brain associates achievement with safety. Completing tasks releases dopamine, which reinforces the behavior. Over time, the brain craves that hit not just for pleasure, but for reassurance. Doing becomes a way to regulate emotion. When you are busy, you do not have to sit with discomfort. Stillness starts to feel unsafe. The validating truth is this: you did not invent this belief. It was taught, modeled, and rewarded. In many environments, productivity is treated as character. Hardworking means good, resting means weak. So your brain adapted. It learned what earned approval and built an identity around it. That was not a flaw. It was survival. But here is the cost. When your worth depends on productivity, you are never done. There is always more you could be doing. Even success feels temporary because it only counts until the next task. Satisfaction gets postponed. You start living in a constant state of becoming, never arriving. And when you cannot perform, you feel invisible or disposable. This belief also distorts how you see others. You admire people for what they produce, not who they are. You judge yourself and others harshly during slow periods. You forget that humans are not machines. Energy fluctuates. Capacity changes. Value does not. There is a deeper consequence, too. When productivity equals self-worth, you stop listening to your body. Rest feels like betrayal. Limits feel like weakness. You override signals of burnout because slowing down would threaten your identity. Eventually, the body forces a stop, and when it does, the emotional crash is severe because you are left without the metric you use to measure yourself. The shift begins when you separate value from output. That sounds abstract, but it starts with something concrete. Noticing how you talk to yourself on unproductive days. If the tone turns critical or shaming, that is the belief in action. You are not reacting to the situation. You are defending your worth. Instead of asking, "What did I accomplish today?" you ask, "How did I show up? Did I act with integrity? Did I listen? Did I rest when I needed to? Did I try even if progress was slow?" Those questions anchor value in being, not doing. They feel unfamiliar at first because they are not rewarded as loudly, but they are more stable. This does not mean productivity stops mattering. Output is useful. Effort is meaningful. The difference is that productivity becomes something you do, not something you are. When it fluctuates, your self-regard does not collapse. You can have an off day without turning it into an identity crisis. Over time, this shift changes how you work. You become more sustainable, more creative, less driven by fear. Ironically, productivity often improves when it is no longer carrying the weight of your worth. The nervous system relaxes, focus deepens. Work becomes an expression, not a proof. Once you realize how often you tied your value to output, confusing mental noise with intuition, it hits you suddenly and feels important, a strong sense, a warning, a pull. You think, "This is my intuition talking. I should listen." It feels urgent, emotionally charged, and personal. And because it arrives quickly and confidently, you trust it. You act on it, or you let it steer your decisions quietly in the background. The shocking part is that most of the time, what people call intuition is just mental noise wearing a serious tone. A mix of anxiety, old fears, unfinished thoughts, and random associations firing at once. But because it shows up without effort and feels certain, the brain treats it as wisdom. It does not stop to check where it came from. It assumes depth because of speed. This confusion happens because real intuition and mental noise share some surface qualities. Both are fast. Both are non-verbal at first. Both feel like a knowing rather than a thought. The difference is subtle but crucial. Intuition is usually calm, quiet, and clear. Mental noise is loud, repetitive, and emotionally charged. But when you are stressed, tired, or overwhelmed, the noise gets louder than your ability to distinguish it. Neuroscience helps explain why this happens. The brain is constantly generating predictions. Most of them never reach awareness. When you are anxious, the prediction system becomes hyperactive. It throws out possibilities rapidly, especially negative ones, to try to protect you. These predictions feel instinctual because they bypass deliberate thinking. But instinctual does not mean accurate. Think about how this shows up. You get a bad feeling about a situation without clear evidence. You feel pulled away from an opportunity because something feels off. You assume someone cannot be trusted based on a vague internal reaction. Later, sometimes you are right, but many times you realize the feeling was driven by fear, insecurity, or past experiences that had nothing to do with the present moment. What makes this default especially convincing is hindsight bias. When the noise happens to align with an outcome, your brain labels it intuition and remembers it. When it does not, you forget it. Over time, this selective memory builds confidence in the signal, even though it is unreliable. You start trusting the feeling itself rather than evaluating its track record. The validating truth is this: your brain is not broken for producing noise. Mental chatter is normal. The mind evolved to simulate, anticipate, and warn. Silence was never the goal. The problem starts when you stop thinking consciously and let every internal signal carry equal weight. Not every feeling deserves authority. There is also an emotional payoff to calling noise intuition. It makes decisions feel justified without effort. You do not have to explain or analyze. You can say it just felt right or wrong. That protects you from uncertainty and responsibility. But it also limits growth. If every uncomfortable feeling is treated as guidance, you end up avoiding exactly the situations that would teach you something new. Real intuition usually has a different quality. It is not frantic. It does not shout. It often arrives after experience, not in the absence of it. It feels grounded rather than urgent. And importantly, it does not collapse when questioned. You can examine it without it turning defensive. Mental noise, on the other hand, intensifies when challenged. It insists. It repeats. It demands immediate action. Here is the cost of confusing the two. You start making fear-based decisions while calling them wisdom. You shrink your world while telling yourself you are being discerning. You mistrust opportunities, people, and yourself because the loudest signal gets the final say. Over time, you may feel stuck or disconnected, wondering why following your intuition has not led to clarity or peace. This pattern also erodes self-trust in a subtle way. When you act on noisy signals and regret the outcome, you either double down or start doubting your inner guidance entirely. Both responses are extremes. The real issue was never intuition itself. It was the lack of discernment between signal and static. The shift begins when you slow the moment down. Instead of asking, "What do I feel?" you ask, "What is the quality of this feeling? Is it calm or tense? Clear or scattered? Grounded or urgent? Does it invite curiosity or demand avoidance?" Those questions re-engage conscious awareness. They separate intuition from anxiety. Another key distinction is timing. Intuition often emerges after you have taken in information, even if you cannot articulate it fully. Mental noise often appears when information is missing and your brain is trying to fill the gap. If the feeling shows up strongest when you know the least, it is likely noise. This does not mean you ignore your internal world. It means automatically defending existing beliefs against new evidence. The moment new information challenges what you already believe, something tightens inside you. Not curiosity, not openness, resistance. You feel the urge to explain, dismiss, counter, or scroll away. Before you even process the evidence, your mind starts building a defense. That cannot be right. That is exaggerated. That does not apply to me. And just like that, the door closes. The shocking part is how fast this happens. You do not experience it as defensiveness. You experience it as thinking, as discernment, as being smart enough not to fall for nonsense. The brain frames the reaction as protecting truth, when in reality it is protecting identity. Because many of your beliefs are not just ideas. They are part of how you understand yourself and your place in the world. This default exists because beliefs are not stored neutrally in the brain. They are linked to emotion, memory, and social belonging. When a belief forms, especially one you have held for a long time, it becomes embedded in your sense of coherence. It helps you predict reality. It tells you who you are. So when new evidence threatens it, the brain does not treat that as a neutral update. It treats it as a threat. Neuroscience shows that when core beliefs are challenged, the same brain regions activate as when you experience physical danger. The amygdala lights up, stress responses kick in, your thinking narrows. In that state, the goal is not accuracy. It is survival. The brain wants the discomfort to stop, and the fastest way to do that is to reject the new information. Think about how often this shows up. You read something that contradicts your views and immediately look for flaws. You hear feedback and focus on defending your intent instead of considering the impact. Someone presents data and you question the source, the motive, the framing. Sometimes those critiques are valid, but often they appear instantly before real evaluation happens. The conclusion was decided first. The reasoning came later. Psychology calls this confirmation bias and belief perseverance. Once a belief is established, the brain preferentially seeks information that confirms it and resists information that contradicts it. Even when faced with strong evidence, people often cling to their original belief, not because the evidence is weak, but because updating the belief feels destabilizing. What makes this default especially convincing is how rational it feels. You are not shouting or panicking. You are calmly explaining why the new information is flawed. You feel intelligent, grounded, reasonable. But if you look closely, the reasoning is one-sided. The mind is not asking, could this be true? It is asking, how can I prove this wrong? The validating truth is this. Your brain is not stubborn by accident. It evolved to prioritize consistency. A stable internal model of the world reduces cognitive load. Constantly updating beliefs is expensive and unsettling. So the brain defaults to defending what it already knows. That efficiency helped us survive. In a complex modern world, it can keep us stuck. There is also a social layer. Many beliefs are tied to groups, family, culture, profession, identity. Changing a belief can feel like betraying where you came from or who you align with. The brain senses that risk and tightens its grip. It would rather be wrong and belong than right and feel alone. The cost of this default is not just intellectual, it is emotional. When you automatically defend existing beliefs, learning slows. Growth becomes selective. You miss opportunities to refine your understanding. And over time, your worldview hardens. You become less curious, more certain, and ironically more fragile. Because the more rigid a belief system becomes, the more threatened it feels by anything new. There is also an internal consequence. When you cannot update beliefs easily, you end up defending ideas that no longer serve you. Old narratives about yourself, about what is possible, about what you deserve. Evidence shows up in your life that contradicts them, but you explain it away. So change feels impossible, even when reality is offering proof that it is not. The shift begins when you notice the emotional reaction before the argument. That spike of irritation, that urge to dismiss, that tightening in the chest. Those are signals that a belief is being challenged. Instead of following the reflex, you pause. You do not agree or disagree yet. You just acknowledge that something inside you feels threatened. Then you ask a different question. Not is this true or false, but what would it mean if this were true? That question bypasses defensiveness. It opens a hypothetical space. You are not committing to change. You are exploring. The nervous system stays calmer because identity is not immediately on the line. Another powerful shift is separating beliefs from self-worth. You remind, assuming others see situations the same way you do. You walk into a situation already knowing what it means. The tone feels obvious to you. The problem feels clear. The right response feels almost self-evident. So you move forward assuming everyone else is seeing the same thing through the same lens. When they react differently, you feel confused, or annoyed, or hurt, because from your perspective, they are missing something obvious. The shocking part is that it does not even feel like an assumption. It feels like reality. You are not thinking this is how I see it. You are thinking this is how it is. So when someone disagrees, delays, or responds in a way that does not match your expectations, your brain does not register difference. It registers error. They are being difficult, unreasonable, inconsiderate, or deliberately obtuse. This happens because the brain treats perception as objective by default. You experience your thoughts, interpretations, and emotional reactions as direct responses to the world, not as filtered constructions. It does not feel like your version of events. It feels like the events themselves. So without conscious effort, you assume others are operating with the same information, priorities, and emotional context. Psychologically, this is called the false consensus effect. The brain overestimates how much other people share your beliefs, interpretations, and reactions. It makes sense from an efficiency standpoint. Assuming shared perspective reduces uncertainty. It simplifies social coordination. But it also creates blind spots, especially in emotionally charged or complex situations. Think about how often this shows up. You think a comment was clearly sarcastic, so you assume everyone heard it that way. You think a decision is obviously unfair, so you expect universal agreement. You feel uncomfortable in a situation and assume others must feel it too. When they do not, you start questioning their awareness or their character instead of questioning the assumption. What makes this default especially potent is emotional realism. When something feels strong to you, it feels significant, and when it feels significant, you assume it should be significant to others. If you are stressed, the issue feels urgent. If you are hurt, the slight feels serious. If you are excited, the opportunity feels obvious. The brain projects the intensity of your internal experience outward and expects it to be mirrored. The validating truth is this: you are not egocentric for doing this. It is a basic feature of human cognition. You only have direct access to your own mind. Everyone else's internal world is inferred, so the brain fills in the gaps using itself as the template. That is not arrogance. It is limitation. The problem is what happens when this assumption goes unchallenged. Misunderstandings multiply. Conflicts escalate. You feel unseen or unsupported because people do not respond the way you expect. They feel confused or pressured because they are reacting to a situation you think is obvious but feels different to them. Both sides feel misunderstood. This is especially damaging in close relationships. You assume your partner knows why you are upset because it feels obvious to you. You assume a friend understands the weight of something because it feels heavy in your body. When they do not respond accordingly, you interpret it as lack of care rather than lack of shared perspective. Resentment grows not from malice, but from assumption. There is also a communication trap here. When you believe others see things the same way, you explain less. You skip context. You leave emotional cues unspoken. You think you are being clear, but you are actually being incomplete. The other person is left guessing, and their guesses are based on their own internal world, not yours. The gap widens. Neuroscience adds another layer. Stress narrows perspective. When you are emotionally activated, your brain becomes less capable of imagining other viewpoints. Empathy drops. Certainty increases. That is why disagreements feel more polarized under pressure. Each person feels more convinced of their interpretation and less curious about alternatives. The cost of this default is not just external conflict. It is internal frustration. You feel like people constantly misunderstand you. Like you have to carry the emotional weight alone. Like things would be easier if others just got it. But the issue is not intelligence or care. It is perspective. The shift begins when you replace assumption with inquiry. Instead of assuming shared understanding, you check, not defensively, not accusatorily, just plainly. How did you see that? What did that mean to you? What felt important there? Those questions feel unnecessary when you are convinced the meaning is obvious. But they are exactly what prevent misalignment. This does not mean you invalidate your own perspective. Your experience is real. Your interpretation matters. The shift is recognizing that it is one interpretation among many, not the default setting everyone else is using. When you name your perspective instead of assuming it, communication becomes clearer. You say, "This is how it landed for me," instead of "you know how that was." Something subtle but powerful happens when you do this. You stop feeling personally rejected when others respond, prioritizing short-term relief over long-term benefit. The urge shows up quietly but powerfully. You feel discomfort rising and your mind immediately looks for a way out. Not the best way, the fastest way. Something to take the edge off, to distract, to soothe, to make the feeling stop right now. And in that moment, the future disappears. All that matters is relief. The shocking part is how convincing this feels. Short-term relief does not announce itself as avoidance. It feels practical, sensible, necessary. You tell yourself, "I will deal with this later. I just need a break. I deserve this." And because the relief actually works in the moment, your brain treats the choice as correct. The discomfort fades, even briefly, and that reinforces the behavior. This happens because the brain is wired to reduce pain as quickly as possible. Immediate discomfort triggers the same systems as threat. Stress hormones rise. Attention narrows. The nervous system wants resolution now, not optimization later. Long-term benefits are abstract. Short-term relief is tangible. The brain will almost always choose what it can feel immediately over what it can only imagine. Neuroscience explains why this default is so strong. Relief activates reward pathways. When discomfort drops, dopamine is released. The brain learns this sequence fast. Discomfort followed by escape equals safety. Over time, this becomes automatic. You do not weigh pros and cons. You follow the path that has worked before, the one that quieted the nervous system quickly. Think about how often this shows up. You avoid a hard conversation to keep the peace, even though the issue grows. You procrastinate to escape anxiety, even though the deadline looms. You numb with scrolling, food, or distraction instead of sitting with an uncomfortable feeling. Each choice makes sense in the moment. Each one trades a small present relief for a larger future cost. What makes this default especially tricky is that it disguises itself as self-care. You tell yourself you are protecting your mental health, preserving energy, not pushing too hard, and sometimes that is true. Rest matters. Relief matters. The problem is not relief itself. It is relief without awareness of the pattern. When every uncomfortable feeling is treated as something to escape, growth stalls. The validating truth is this: your brain is not weak for choosing relief. It is doing exactly what it evolved to do. In environments where survival depended on immediate response, prioritizing short-term comfort made sense. The issue is that modern challenges are rarely resolved by immediate relief. They are resolved by sustained, often uncomfortable action. Here is where the cost becomes clear. When you consistently prioritize short-term relief, problems do not disappear. They accumulate. The conversation avoided becomes resentment. The task delayed becomes stress. The feeling numbed becomes louder later. And because the relief was temporary, you have to repeat it. Again and again, the brain becomes dependent on escape rather than resolution. There is also a self-trust erosion that happens. You make promises to yourself in moments of clarity, then break them in moments of discomfort. Over time, you stop believing your own intentions. You think you lack discipline or willpower. In reality, your nervous system has just been trained to prioritize comfort over alignment. Psychology shows that humans heavily discount the future. This is called temporal discounting. The brain values immediate rewards more than delayed ones, even if the delayed reward is larger. That bias explains why long-term goals feel fragile in the face of present discomfort. The future does not feel real enough to compete with now. The shift begins when you start recognizing the relief pattern in real time, not after, in the moment when the urge to escape appears. That urge is the signal. Instead of asking, "How do I make this stop?" you ask, "What am I trying to avoid right now?" That question brings awareness back online. It slows the automatic loop. This does not mean you force yourself into misery. It means you pause long enough to choose consciously. Sometimes relief is the right choice. Sometimes rest is exactly what you need. The difference is intention. When you choose relief knowingly, it does not reinforce avoidance. When you choose it automatically, it does. Another powerful shift is reframing discomfort. Instead of seeing it as something to eliminate, you see it as information. Discomfort often signals that something matters. A boundary, a value, a growth edge. When you learn to tolerate short bursts of discomfort, the nervous system adapts. The urge to escape weakens because the brain learns that you can survive the feeling without immediate relief. Long-term benefit usually does not feel good at first. It feels awkward, effortful, uncertain, but it compounds. Each time you stay present instead of escaping, you build capacity. Each time you choose alignment over relief, you strengthen self-trust. The payoff is delayed, but it is real and lasting. Over time, something shifts internally. You stop being driven by urgency. You become less reactive, trusting repetition as proof of truth. You hear something once, and it barely registers. You hear it again, and it sounds familiar. You hear it a third time, and it starts feeling true, not because you checked it, not because you examined the evidence, but because it keeps showing up. The statement settles into your mind like background music, and eventually, you stop questioning it altogether. The shocking part is that repetition does not feel persuasive while it is happening. It feels neutral, passive, almost harmless. You are not agreeing with the idea consciously. You are just being exposed to it. But the brain does not require agreement to form belief. It only requires familiarity, and familiarity quietly turns into credibility. This happens because the brain uses fluency as a shortcut for truth. When something is repeated, it becomes easier to process, easier to recall, easier to recognize. That ease feels good to the brain, and the brain often mistakes ease for accuracy. If an idea comes to mind quickly, it must be valid. If it feels familiar, it must be reliable. That is the illusion. Psychology calls this the illusory truth effect. Studies show that people are more likely to rate repeated statements as true, even when they know the source is unreliable or the information was previously labeled false. The brain does not store truth and repetition separately very well. Over time, it remembers the content but forgets the context. You remember the claim, not where it came from or whether it was ever verified. Think about how often this shows up. You hear the same narrative about success, relationships, or identity over and over, and it starts shaping how you see yourself. You see the same headline framed the same way across platforms and assume that is just how things are. You repeat a self-critical thought often enough, and it starts feeling like an objective description instead of a habit. What makes this default especially powerful is that repetition often comes from multiple directions: social media, news conversations, internal self-talk. When the same idea echoes through different channels, the brain assumes consensus, and consensus feels like proof. You stop asking, "Is this true?" and start asking, "Why does this keep coming up?" That question already assumes validity. The validating truth is this: your brain is not gullible. It is efficient. It evolved to rely on patterns. In environments where information was scarce, repeated signals often did mean something was important or real. If multiple people warned you about a danger, it made sense to believe them. The problem is that modern information environments repeat things for reasons that have nothing to do with truth. Algorithms reward engagement. Emotions spread faster than accuracy. Loud ideas travel farther than careful ones. There is also an internal version of this effect. The thoughts you repeat to yourself carry the same weight. If you keep telling yourself you are behind, not good enough, or bad at something, those thoughts gain authority simply through repetition. The brain does not check whether the thought is helpful or accurate. It just notices that it appears often, so it must matter. The cost of trusting repetition as proof of truth is subtle but deep. You start building decisions on unexamined assumptions. You adopt limits that were never tested. You feel certain about things you never chose to believe. And because the belief feels familiar, challenging it feels wrong. Like you are denying reality instead of questioning conditioning. This default also makes you vulnerable to manipulation. Advertising relies on it. Propaganda relies on it. Even well-meaning advice can shape you simply by being repeated enough. The brain confuses exposure with evidence. And once a belief feels established, confirmation bias kicks in. You start noticing information that supports it and ignoring what contradicts it. The loop closes. What is especially dangerous is when repetition replaces lived experience. You believe things about yourself or the world, not because you experienced them directly, but because you have heard them enough times. That belief then filters how you interpret your experiences. You see what you expect to see. And that reinforces the original idea. It feels self-evident, but it is circular. The shift begins when you start asking a different question. Not "is this familiar?" but "how do I know this is true?" That question interrupts the fluency shortcut. It forces the brain to look for evidence rather than comfort. Often, you realize there is none. Just repetition, just echoes. Another powerful shift is noticing emotional tone. Repeated ideas that are designed to spread often carry strong emotion. Fear, outrage, shame, certainty. Emotion helps repetition stick. Truth does not need to shout. When something feels urgent and familiar at the same time, that is a signal to slow down, not speed up. This does not mean you distrust everything you hear. It means you stop using frequency as a credibility metric. You separate popularity from accuracy. You recognize that something can be widely repeated and deeply wrong, or rarely said and profoundly true. Internally, this practice changes your relationship with your own mind. When a thought keeps repeating, you stop assuming it must be important. You ask why it is repeating. Habit. Fear. Conditioning. None of those equal truth. Some thoughts are just grooves worn into the brain by time and attention. They persist because they have been rehearsed, interpreting uncertainty as a sign to stop. The uncertainty shows up, and everything inside you slows down. You are moving forward, thinking through something, maybe even feeling momentum. Then a question appears. What if this does not work? What if this goes wrong? What if I am missing something? And without realizing it, your brain translates that uncertainty into a single instruction. Stop. The shocking part is how reasonable that instruction feels. It does not feel like fear. It feels like intelligence, like caution, like being responsible. You tell yourself it would be reckless to move forward without clarity. You convince yourself that waiting is the mature option. But what is actually happening is simpler and more automatic. Your brain is treating uncertainty as danger. The human brain is wired to prefer predictability. Predictability feels safe. When the outcome is known, the nervous system relaxes. When the outcome is unclear, the brain activates threat detection systems. Stress hormones rise, attention narrows, and one of the fastest ways to reduce that internal stress is to stop creating new variables. No movement means no new uncertainty. Neurologically, uncertainty triggers many of the same circuits as physical threat. Your brain does not differentiate between not knowing what will happen and something bad happening. Both feel unresolved. Both demand control. And stopping feels like control. You can see this pattern everywhere. You delay starting something because you do not know how it will turn out. You avoid a conversation because you cannot predict the response. You stay in situations you have outgrown because the alternative is unclear. You tell yourself you are waiting for clarity, but what you are really waiting for is certainty, and certainty rarely arrives first. What makes this default especially powerful is that stopping actually works in the short term. The tension drops. The anxiety quiets. You feel calmer. That relief teaches your brain a lesson. Uncertainty followed by stopping equals safety. So the next time uncertainty shows up, the urge to stop appears even faster. This is where it becomes a trap, because life does not deliver certainty before action. It delivers clarity through action. Most understanding comes after you move, not before. But the brain wants the opposite order. It wants proof first, guarantees, a clear map. When it cannot get those, it assumes something is wrong. Psychology calls this ambiguity aversion. Humans prefer known risks over unknown ones, even when the unknown option has greater upside. The discomfort of not knowing outweighs the potential benefit. So the brain chooses inaction, because inaction feels safer than uncertainty. The validating truth is this: there is nothing broken about you. This response evolved to keep humans alive in dangerous environments. Unknown terrain could mean predators. Hesitation once meant survival. But modern life is full of uncertainty that is not lethal, just uncomfortable. The brain has not updated its alarm system. The cost of interpreting uncertainty as a stop signal is subtle but serious. You do not crash and burn. You stall. You look back months or years later and realize how many things you never tried. Not because you decided against them, but because you waited for a feeling that never came. Over time, this changes how you see yourself. You start believing you are indecisive, or that you overthink, or that you lack confidence. But what is actually happening is that your nervous system is calling the shots instead of your values. The shift begins when you change the meaning of uncertainty. Uncertainty is not a warning. It is a condition. It does not mean do not move. It means you do not know yet. That is a very different message. Instead of asking, will this work, you ask, what is the next small step? Small steps generate information. Information calms the brain more effectively than avoidance ever does. You do not need certainty to take a step. You need willingness. Another critical realization is that certainty itself is not reliable. You have felt certain before and been wrong. You have felt unsure before and succeeded. The feeling of certainty is not proof. It is just a state of the nervous system. When you practice moving while unsure, something changes. You build tolerance for uncertainty. Your brain learns that not knowing does not equal danger. Confidence stops coming from guarantees and starts coming from self-trust. Trust that you can adapt. Trust that you can respond. Eventually, uncertainty loses its authority. It still appears, but it no longer controls your behavior. You stop treating fog as a wall and start treating it as terrain. And once you see how often you stopped simply because things were unclear, you realize how many doors were never locked. You just turned away because you mistook uncertainty for a sign to stop, when it was actually the place where movement was supposed to begin. Defaulting to avoidance instead of resolution. An avoidance does not announce itself loudly. It slips in quietly as a reasonable choice. You tell yourself now is not the right time. I will deal with this later. It is not that important. And for a moment the pressure lifts. The discomfort eases. You feel like you made the smart move. You protected your energy. You kept the peace. You stayed functional. The shocking part is that avoidance feels like relief, not failure. It feels like control. Resolution feels messy, emotional, and uncertain. Avoidance feels clean, calm, immediate. So the brain learns very quickly which option feels better in the moment. Not which one actually solves the problem, but which one makes the discomfort stop right now. Your brain is wired to reduce stress as efficiently as possible. When something feels threatening emotionally, conflict, vulnerability, effort, or uncertainty, the nervous system reacts the same way it would to physical danger. Heart rate increases, muscles tense, attention narrows, and one of the fastest ways to shut that system down is to remove yourself from the trigger. Avoidance works. That is why it becomes the default. Think about how often this shows up. You avoid a conversation because it might be awkward. You avoid a task because it feels overwhelming. You avoid a decision because you might regret it. You avoid looking at a problem because facing it would force change. Each time, The brain says we will come back to this later. But later rarely arrives on its own. What makes this especially deceptive is that avoidance often looks like patience or self-control. You tell yourself you are being calm instead of reactive, that you are choosing peace over drama. But there is a difference between pausing intentionally and avoiding indefinitely. One leads to clarity, the other leads to accumulation. The validating truth is this: avoidance is not laziness or weakness. It is a nervous system strategy. Your brain is trying to keep you regulated. It does not care about long-term consequences. It cares about reducing distress in the present moment. From that perspective, avoidance is successful. The discomfort drops. The threat feels gone, but unresolved problems do not disappear. They go quiet. And quiet problems have a way of growing. The conversation you avoid becomes tension. The task you delay becomes anxiety. The boundary you do not set becomes resentment. Because resolution requires engagement, and engagement requires discomfort. Avoidance feels safer, even when it costs more over time. Psychologically, avoidance reinforces itself through negative reinforcement. When you avoid something and feel relief, the brain learns that avoidance is effective. That relief becomes the reward. So the next time a similar discomfort appears, your brain reaches for the same solution automatically. You are not choosing avoidance consciously. It is being chosen for you. Over time, this shapes your identity. You start seeing yourself as someone who hates confrontation, who struggles with follow-through, who gets stuck. You assume these are personality traits. In reality, they are habits formed by a nervous system that learned escape instead of resolution. There is also a hidden emotional toll. Avoidance keeps you in a low-grade state of stress. Even when you are not actively thinking about the issue, your brain knows it is there. Unfinished things create cognitive load. They drain attention and energy quietly. You feel tired without knowing why, irritable without a clear cause. That is unresolved tension leaking into everything else. Resolution, on the other hand, is uncomfortable upfront but stabilizing long-term. It requires facing emotions, uncertainty, or effort directly. That spike in discomfort is what the brain tries to avoid. But once the issue is addressed, the nervous system actually settles. There is nothing left to scan for. No loose end pulling at your attention. The shift begins when you stop asking, "How do I make this go away?" and start asking, "What would actually resolve this?" That question reframes the situation. It brings long-term relief back into the picture. Not relief from escaping, but relief from completion. Another important shift is shrinking the definition of resolution. Resolution does not mean fixing everything perfectly. It means engaging honestly, having the conversation, taking the first step, making a decision, even if it is imperfect. Avoidance thrives when resolution feels too big. When you break it down, the threat level drops. There is also power in recognizing the moment avoidance shows up. That urge to distract, delay, or disengage is the signal, not a command, a cue. It tells you this matters. That discomfort often points directly at the thing that would create the most relief if handled. As you practice choosing resolution in small ways, your nervous system adapts. The brain learns that discomfort does not equal danger. That engagement does not destroy you. Each time you face instead of flee, you build tolerance. Avoidance loses its grip because it is no longer the only way to feel safe. Eventually, something shifts internally. Assuming problems will resolve themselves if ignored, there is a quiet belief that slips into your mind when something feels uncomfortable or overwhelming. If I do nothing, This will probably sort itself out. Time will handle it. Distance will soften it. Silence will dissolve it. So you wait. You distract yourself. You hope the problem loses momentum on its own. The shocking part is how calm that belief feels. It does not feel reckless. It feels patient, mature, like you are not overreacting. You tell yourself you are giving things space, letting emotions cool, trusting the natural order. But underneath that story is a much simpler assumption. That problems fade without engagement. Your brain loves this idea because it promises relief without effort. Doing nothing costs less energy than doing something. It avoids confrontation, uncertainty, and emotional strain. And in the short term, it works. The anxiety dips. The pressure eases. You feel lighter for a while. That relief convinces the brain that ignoring the issue was the right move. This happens because the brain is biased toward conserving energy and minimizing stress. When a problem triggers discomfort, the nervous system looks for the fastest way to lower that discomfort. Ignoring feels safer than addressing. Addressing means thinking, feeling, acting. Ignoring means postponing all of that. The brain does not ask whether the problem is solved. It only notices that the discomfort dropped. Think about how often this shows up. You ignore a growing tension in a relationship, assuming it will blow over. You avoid checking something important because you do not want bad news. You let a small issue slide at work, thinking it is not worth the hassle. You tell yourself it is probably fine. And sometimes, small things do fade. That occasional success strengthens the belief. But here is the part the brain misses. Most problems do not resolve themselves. They either stay the same or quietly grow. The issue you ignore does not disappear. It just moves out of conscious focus, and what stays out of focus still shapes your stress, your behavior, and your decisions. The validating truth is this: ignoring problems is not laziness or denial. It is a protective response. Your brain is trying to shield you from discomfort, from emotional spikes, from uncertainty, from effort. That strategy made sense in environments where threats passed quickly or resolved externally. But many modern problems require active participation. They do not expire on their own. Psychologically, this pattern is linked to avoidance coping. When facing something feels too taxing, the mind chooses disengagement. The problem is that avoidance coping trades short-term comfort for long-term strain. The brain feels better now, but it stays on alert in the background because the issue is unresolved. That low-level vigilance drains energy over time. Unaddressed problems create mental load. Even when you are not thinking about them directly, your brain knows they exist. That awareness keeps stress hormones slightly elevated. You feel tired without knowing why, irritable without a clear cause, distracted even when nothing obvious is wrong. That is the cost of unresolved tension. There is also a false hope built into this default. You assume external forces will fix what requires internal action. That time will change dynamics that actually need communication. That distance will heal something that needs honesty. That silence will repair what needs attention. When the problem persists, you feel confused or frustrated, as if reality broke a promise it never made. Over time, this belief shapes behavior. You start delaying more, putting off conversations, letting things slide. You tell yourself you are easygoing or low drama, but inside things pile up. The resentment, the anxiety, the sense of being behind. And when the problem finally demands attention, it feels bigger than it ever needed to be. The shift begins when you challenge the assumption itself. Instead of asking, "Will this go away?" you ask, "What happens if it does not?" That question brings reality back into focus. It forces you to consider the trajectory, not just the momentary relief. Another important realization is that resolution does not require intensity. Many people avoid problems because they imagine addressing them will be explosive or exhausting. In reality, early engagement is usually simpler and calmer than delayed confrontation. Small course corrections prevent major breakdowns. There is also power in recognizing that ignoring is still a choice. Doing nothing is not neutral. It is an action with consequences. Once you see that, you regain agency. You are no longer waiting for things to magically improve. You are deciding whether to engage or not, with full awareness of the trade-off. As you practice addressing things sooner, your nervous system adapts. The brain learns that engagement does not equal catastrophe. That discomfort spikes briefly and then settles. That problems handled directly create relief that lasts longer than the relief of avoidance. Eventually, your relationship with problems changes. They stop feeling like threats and start feeling like signals. Signals that something needs attention. Not panic, not perfection, just presence. Believing being busy means being effective, and your calendar is full and your mind feels crowded. You bounce from task to task, reply to messages, handle small problems, keep things moving. At the end of the day, you are drained, but there is also a strange comfort in that exhaustion. You tell yourself, I was busy today. That must mean I was effective. The shocking part is how natural that conclusion feels. Business feels like proof. Movement feels like progress. When you are constantly doing something, it feels like you are contributing, advancing, earning your place. Sitting still feels risky. Slowing down feels irresponsible. So you stay in motion, even when you are not sure what the motion is actually producing. The brain loves business because it creates the feeling of control. When you are busy, you are responding. You are reacting. You are occupied. There is no empty space for doubt to creep in. Effectiveness, on the other hand, requires reflection. It asks uncomfortable questions. Is this the right thing? Does this matter? Is this actually moving anything forward? Those questions create uncertainty, and the brain would rather stay busy than uncertain. Cognitively, effort is easier to measure than impact. You can count hours worked, tasks completed, emails sent. Impact is delayed and abstract. Sometimes you do the most effective thing and nothing immediately changes. The brain struggles with that delay, so it defaults to what it can see and feel. If I am tired, I must have been productive. If I was productive, I must have been effective. This shows up everywhere. You spend hours answering messages, but avoid the one decision that would simplify everything. You sit in meetings that fill your day, but do not move the core issue. You organize, tweak, prepare, and stay responsive, while the most important work waits because it feels heavier and more exposed. At the end of the day, you feel spent, but the thing that actually matters is still untouched. What makes this default even stronger is social reinforcement. Busy is respected. Busy sounds important. When someone asks how you are and you say busy, it signals demand and relevance. Effectiveness does not always look impressive. Sometimes it looks quiet. Sometimes it looks like saying no. Sometimes it looks like doing one thing slowly instead of many things fast. That does not get the same approval. The validating truth is this: you did not invent this belief. Many systems reward activity over impact, responsiveness over depth, speed over thought. Your brain adapted to that environment. Staying busy became a way to stay safe, valued, and needed. It makes sense that your nervous system learned to equate motion with worth. But effectiveness is about leverage, not volume. It is about choosing actions that create disproportionate results. That often means doing less, protecting focus, letting some things drop, and that feels uncomfortable. Because when you do less, you have to sit with the question of whether what you are doing actually matters. Business lets you avoid that question. There is also an emotional layer here. Constant activity can mask anxiety. When you stop, thoughts catch up. Doubt surfaces. Am I doing enough? Am I choosing the right direction? Am I valuable without constant output? Staying busy keeps those questions at bay. Effectiveness would require facing them. Psychologically, this ties into action bias. Humans prefer doing something over doing nothing, even when doing nothing would be smarter. Action feels safer than restraint. Movement feels better than pause. So the brain fills time with tasks, even low-value ones, because motion feels like protection. The cost of this default is burnout without fulfillment. You are always tired but rarely satisfied. You are active but not aligned. You stay busy while feeling oddly stuck. Over time, this disconnect creates frustration. You work harder but feel less clear about why. It also erodes intentional thinking. When every moment is filled, there is no space to step back and evaluate. You react instead of choose. You manage time instead of directing it. Business becomes a substitute for purpose. The shift begins when you separate activity from effectiveness. Instead of asking, "What did I do today?" you ask, "What actually moved something forward?" That question can feel uncomfortable because it exposes how much effort goes into things that do not matter much. But it also brings clarity. Another shift is redefining effectiveness internally. Effectiveness is not how full your day is. It is how aligned your actions are with your goals and values. That alignment often requires saying no, leaving space, doing fewer things with more intention. This does not mean becoming idle. It means becoming deliberate, choosing actions for their impact, not their urgency, allowing quiet periods where nothing visible is happening, but thinking, prioritizing, and recalibrating are. Over time, business loses its grip. It stops feeling like proof of worth. It starts feeling like noise. And clarity begins to feel more satisfying than motion. Once you see how often being busy replaced being effective,